What's going on, brothers and sisters? Hopefully y'all can hear me well. I'm outside right now, obviously. So I'm just making sure that you guys can hear me crystal clear. Got this live mic setup going on right now. And Sunday, it sounded like y'all didn't hear me like an up close sound. It sounded like I had a room mic somewhere and it was picking me up. But when our brother Ziggy was reading the scriptures through his mic, it was picking him up close. So that was my first time using the lav mic during the teaching, during the gathering. Normally I just use the wireless thing and just be clipped up here, but I wanted not to have a big chunky thing here. So I put the lav mic. So hopefully y'all can hear me good right now. If I'm sounding real clear to y'all, all right, cool beans. All right, so audio's good. Well, if it's your first time joining us, welcome. I'm Pastor Jay. If it's not your first time, welcome back. You brothers just see the title for today's stream. I didn't want to include it. I didn't want to include this with tomorrow's broadcast, because I want to focus on some other things. But this came up and it was consuming my mind. It's all I could think about, and so I was like, man, you know what? Let me go ahead, and I had to do the reading teaching for the day anyway with the community. So I said, let me just bring it all over here. Things I want to talk to y'all about. Obviously, talk to, as y'all see by the title, to Christian apologists in general. Obviously, as the shoe fits, wear it type of situation. But there is a particular thing that inspired today. But before I get into it, let me open up with prayer, and then we'll get into today's stream in class. All right, so let's open up with prayer right quick, brothers and sisters. Heavenly Father, Yahweh, just thank you for today, Father, for your mercy upon us, allowing us to see today. Give me health and strength and food and clothing, place to lay my head last night, all our heads. Lord, give me the ability to use our limbs. Giving us the ability to use our limbs, Lord, that we may, in our deeds, glorify you, Lord, and help others, Lord, who you lead us to and help us in whatever capacity you may have for us that day. Lord, may you continue to give us the strength that we need for today. Lord, the things that we don't know that we shall meet for today, Lord, may you give us the endurance in that moment to endure those things. And ultimately, Lord, through whatever we go through, Lord, may you give us not only the desire to do what pleases you, but the power to accomplish it. For those, the reason why these things come. And so, Lord, may you help us so that our faith, after enduring many trials, that our faith may be proven to be genuine. And so, Lord, as we set aside this time to have this class and hear your word read and explained and talk about different matters affecting the body as a whole, Lord, pray that you give physical strength to not only my body, but the brothers and sisters that are listening, that it may endure the teaching, the class for today. Also, Lord, open up the hearts, minds, and ears that we may understand according to your spirit and your mind and attitude in which Christ Jesus had, that we must also have, Lord, that we may understand what is right, just, and true, that we be willing to lay down rights and liberties, Lord, for the sake of our brethren, to keep the unity, to help those who may be weak, so that they may become strong in time. Lord, may we walk in love in everything that we do. Lord, may you help us put into practice the things we received from the apostles, and to hold tight to what it is that they delivered, and not follow the excuses and high-sounding reasonings that men give for the different things that they may do, Lord, so that we don't be deceived, and then through our traditions, Lord, be sidestepping your commandments as the Pharisees and scribes and them did during the Lord's time. And so, Lord, ultimately, Lord, may you make all your people one, not only in mind and heart, but in intent and purpose and in works. Lord, that we may be the image of Christ all over the world as you desire. And Lord, may you keep us safe from the hands of our enemies all the way into the day of Christ. And so, Lord, we thank you for all these things in your son, Yeshua Nazareth's name. Amen. All right. Hope your brothers and sisters doing well. Once again, if it's your first time joining us, I'm Pastor Jade. If it's not your first time, welcome back. So, Lord's will, some of these apologetic brothers, man, they watch this class, share the things online, and I talk to some behind the scenes at times and things like that. But so you brothers and sisters know that for the past 2 weeks at least, we've dealt with the topic of Christmas, and we started off by watching 2 documentaries, and um, one was on the origins of it, and the way that I wanted to deal with it, because commonly, guys, y'all see like the posts people post or the videos they'll make, and it'll say, Christians ain't pagan, right? And then they'll just like run to a church father from the late 2nd, early 3rd, 4th century who was celebrating Jesus' birth to say, look, even this church father, they were celebrating the birth of Jesus, right? Or they'll try to make the crazy claim, the more crazier claim, that there's no association with paganism in the feast of Christmas thing. In the feast of Christmas, there's no association with paganism. Everything's Christian origin, everything's holy. None of it's syncretizing pagan ideas or images or symbols into, and reclassifying them as Christian ideas, which is even more. A lot of times when I hear these brothers talk, sometimes I'd be wanting to ask them, who you think that harlot on the horse is in Revelation? Sometimes I'd be wanting to ask. I probably asked in the past. I can't remember all the responses I've gotten over the years, but when I hear people act as if there's no syncretizing, there's no, like, the Christianization period didn't happen, there was no forced converting, there was no, taking idol temples and turning them into churches, there was none of this stuff actually occurred. There's no man of sin. Some of them don't even think the man of sin is within the Christian realm. They think the man of sin is Islam. Like, what? Anyway, they think it's Islam for some reason. But anyway, so sometimes I sit back and I'm like, the beast that Christ talked about in Revelation that would make war with the saints of God and overtake them, and then have also not only spiritual authority over the church matters, but have civil authority over the other nations as well. And since Christ is talking about a historical event that would have came in the future from the time he spoke it, but in our case, our past, before we were born, our generation was born, who is that? Who's the harlot that was right up in that beast? What's that little horn? In the Apostles' Revelation, who was the man of lawlessness that the Spirit was holding back, that Apostle was alluding to in 2 Thessalonians? Like, who was that? It couldn't have been Islam, because he said it was already secretly at work, and what's holding him back, right? Couldn't have been Islam, but also it couldn't have been. But also at the same time, being that this was something he's already telling the church about, and they were already on guards for, it had to be something that was secretly working during their lifetime that had yet to be fully revealed, but they were expecting it. Okay, so it ain't America, it ain't our president. Okay, it ain't Islam that came years later, meaning after Christ and the apostles. It had been something that was already at work, and we know what nation was ruling over that at that time. We know what great power was upon the earth at that time, and sometimes I just wonder, like, what is it, or who is it? Do they think that this is? Because when the apostles talk about a great falling away, for example, that should happen before the Lord returns, and we read like what's going to happen and things like that, and obviously this great falling away wouldn't be like everybody's following Christ, and then all of a sudden something happens overnight, and then all of a sudden this ginormous falling away happens. You'd be like, whoa, we woke up and all these people denying the Lord. What happened? No, this would be something that would be progressive over time, as the apostles said it would, when they talk about how wolves disguised as sheep would come in and lead people astray. So this is something that would be a process that would happen. All right. Series of events, things that lead to eventually this great falling away, but it's not obviously that it's the falling away when it's starting to occur. It's subtle. It's subtle, and it just happens over a time period. And then eventually, next thing you know, you got this counterfeit Christian faith that people are calling themselves Christians, but they're not actually following the Jesus of the Bible, especially since the apostles talked about how many will come with another Jesus, right? Another Jesus. They didn't say how many, they just say another Jesus, all right? There's many versions of a Jesus in the world that's been taught before we were born, right? There's a Jesus that didn't come in a literal body, but he's still the Messiah somehow. There's a Jesus that isn't God. He's just a mere human. There's a Jesus that is you look into some of these ancient arguments and things that happened in the past. There's this Jesus that wasn't literally in flesh. He was like a hologram. He just kind of appeared, right? So you got these different versions of a Jesus, and then when it comes to Christ's teachings, there's different versions of what Jesus taught, right? So give a quick example, right? Jesus Christ, one of the teachings that Christ taught was, for example, is love your neighbor, love your enemy. And then when the apostles expounded upon what that looked like, that meant causing no harm or seeking to do no harm to your neighbor. And it's about all violence is hatred, and all hatred is murder, and no murder has eternal life in them, right? So they expounded upon what this looks like. But as time goes on, now there's these group of people that teaches about a Jesus while dressed up in WWE, MMA, UFC garments, and then make excuses for other believers to do the same and to participate in it. They go to these events where these murderers work, and then they march them out to the ring, and they proclaim the good news about Jesus in the ring and at the weigh-ins and all these type of things, even though the thing that the actual event and the job that the person is doing is anti-Christ. But these people would then say, well, the Bible doesn't explicitly condemn what they're doing, so you can't judge them. They're preaching a different kind of Jesus, all right? They preach a whole different kind of Jesus, one that allows murder, all right? The real Jesus didn't allow murder. Their fake Jesus allows murder, okay? So, and hatred and violence and trash talking and excuses it, all right? So these blasphemies about Christ's person and these blasphemies about Christ's teachings will go out into the world. Many antichrists, many deceivers, and the great falling away will happen gradually over time through those means. It wouldn't be some overnight thing that happens and all of a sudden 80% of the Christian world just woke up the next day and said, we don't believe in Jesus. This would be something that gradually happens over time. All right. So with that being the case, that would mean that as we are examining what we call church history, we will then see if we actually believe the words of the apostles of Christ, we will actually see the playing out of what they said. Okay. I don't read church history expecting that as I look at church history, it's going to be this grand history of how the church took the world over and through just evangelistic measures, and there was no evil they did, there was no wars, there was no murder, there was no forced conversions, there was no threatening people to die if they didn't accept the cross symbol or they didn't accept the authority of the Pope. Like I'm not expected to see those things when I'm looking at church history. Instead, starting with the scriptures and the things that the apostles said regarding the great falling away, how the hearts will grow to be, how the people will act, how these many different deceivers and antichrists will come out of the world. When we look at church history, I expect to see only a tiny remnant of truth that is retained, while the mass majority of it is all these antichrists and false teachers. All right? Because there's many, many lies, one truth. One faith, one Lord, one baptism, but many other Jesuses. So I only expect a little bit to be this retaining of the good news and the character and life that we should live our lives, while examining the other things. I expect to see murder, hatred, hardness of hearts, people betraying one another, Christians killing and murdering Christians because they don't like the way somebody else is explaining something. Like I expect to see those things, and that's why when you look at church history, it's full of it. It's like 90% full of it. Okay, so I expect to see the playing out of what Christ and the apostles have said, and I expect a remnant to hold on to what the apostles actually established. That's why I'm expecting here. But the way that some people argue is as if, man, the church grew exponentially. It got huge and large. It became one of the world's largest, if not the largest, religion, with Catholicism leading the way of all the denominations. They're the largest Christian denomination in the world. And this was all because they preached the good news about Jesus. No, it ain't. War, sword, conquest. That's how they advanced their mission. And it spread the way that it did. All right. But for people who argue as if syncretism, even though we got edicts and letters, right, that show them clearly doing this, but because God made the trees, people make excuses. Hey, them rocks that the Gentiles were using to sacrifice the false gods on it, God made those rocks. So we could just kind of recall it the altar of God. We don't have to tear it down. We don't have to, kind of like utterly erase the name of those gods from under the earth. We can just wash off the altar they used and then now rededicate that to God because God made the rocks and rocks are inanimate objects and, all these excuses that people make. And so when it comes to Alliance Christian Apologists, I sit back and I observe and sometimes move in and out, in different panels and have discussions with people. The common thing is that any person who's defending the faith, always defending Christ, and we all talk the same. We go, hey, it's all about this Bible, even though it's not Bible. I'm just symbolically holding up something so y'all can get the point. It's about the Bible. It's about the gospel. Everybody says that, right? Everybody says that. Nobody says, I only like certain things Christ said. I don't like everything that Christ says. And so I'm only going to defend the things I like. Like nobody talks like that. It's about the gospel. Like everybody talks as if they're about everything that Christ gave us. And while they're saying these things, it's all about the Bible. Imagine me right now if I'm like, yo, listen, I'm here. This is about the gospel. And we about to go talk about the good news because people got to be born again. And imagine I'm here and I'm talking like that. And then while y'all are looking at me, right here, if this was my room, if this was a wall, and on my wall, on my literal wall, while I'm talking to you about the gospel and the good news of Jesus Christ, on my literal wall is the Egyptian god Ra. What would you think of me? It's the good news, Jesus Christ is the Christ, and blah, 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 blah. Yeah, right here, while I'm defending the gospel, I'm laying it down. I've been laying it down. I laid it down so far down that I put up something that the Lord hates right in everybody's face. I have no conviction when I go live. I didn't scoop to the side so nobody can see it, kind of get it out of frame because I'm embarrassed. I don't want nobody to see that because I know it's bad, but I got it. But I know people going to think and say what they say, and I don't want them to see that about me. So I'm going to turn the camera angle so y'all don't see it. No, instead, I'm like this. Thing right here, boom. And I'm like, we're here about the gospel. What do you think about those? What would the apostles of Jesus Christ think about those kind of people? I don't care about personalities and things like that. I don't care about that. What would the Lord think if while I'm talking to you about Christ, I'm about to go celebrate Mithra this afternoon and I got on a little Mithra garment, but I'm talking to you about Jesus. Or I'm talking to you about Jesus while right here, while I'm meditating, is a big Buddha statue right there. Big Buddha statue right there. What would you think of me? What would you think of me? And not just what you think of me, because people's minds can be deceived. What do you think God thinks of me? What do you think God thinks of me? Imagine this. God is angry, right? He's angry at all the idols of the nations because these people serve demons, right? And then they distort the truth of God and create their stupid images that they worship, right? And then they make them into statues and stuff. And here it is. God hates it. He's going to destroy the world because of it. And now here I am. I bought it. I put it on my desk. Boom. Or put it on my wall. Boom. God is angry. Now he's angry with me because now I don't abhor what he abhors. Instead, I've seen it so much, I put it up as if it's some prized thing that should be glared upon by visitors who come to my house. But I get online before his people and I do the whole church lingo and all that and talk about, it's about this Bible. It's about this Bible. What would the Lord think of me? Okay. And I see that more and more and more where men like Tertullian, that people love to quote, if he saw y'all brothers supposed to be defending the faith and y'all about the Bible and it's all about Christ And then yet, while you're talking about that, you're trying to convince others about following Jesus, while at the same time, your entire garment that you have on is decked out. And you got Mayweather picture here, okay? Mayweather picture here. You got a WWE belt on your shoulder because you think you're the Apologist champion. So you got the WWE belt right here, Mayweather on your shirt. Your hat is whatever your favorite NFL team is, and you sitting in front of God's people talking about this all about the Bible, about God, the gospel. People like Tertullian, that people love to quote, especially when they want to prove Christianity and the white man religion. They love to bring up Tertullian. All right. The man Tertullian wrote an entire book, all right, called The Shows and the Speculists. And he spent chapters upon chapters telling every Christian during his lifetime of how attending these public spectacles, all right, these fights, these competitive sport events, the gladiator games, the Olympics, the chariot races, all these things. By attending those things, you're actually defying your baptismal confession. This is what Tertullian said. Okay? That's what he said. And he was telling people that they must come out from it because it's incompatible with your faith. Now, I was already out of this stuff before I ever discovered Tertullian, all right? But when people brought him up, because they kept talking about him, so I'm like, who's the guy? So go and look at him, then I found out he wrote this whole giant letter, big book, saying the very same things that I'm telling people today that they, don't want to talk about, all right? And where they think it's a Romans 14 issue, but they keep using his writings, the actual guy whose writings they keep using wouldn't even think they were actually Christians. So when they use his writings, they're using his writings like they're standing side by side with Tertullian. But if Tertullian was alive while they're quoting his writings, Tertullian would see them in their little Mayweather shirts and their NFL hats and their little garments and stuff like that. And Tertullian would step to the side like this. Like, who are you? You deceivers. He would call them deceivers because they're perverting the good news about Christ and the life that grace teaches us to live. So I sit down and I'm watching this, and the more I keep hearing it's about the Bible, and the Bible does explicitly this, and that it just annoys me more and more and more. To where even when there are issues, and this actually happens behind the scenes for anybody that don't know. All right, I ain't a lawyer to the apologetic community. I don't care. All right, years ago, well before I was ever a pastor or anything like that. All right. A lot of y'all remember I used to do like apologetics and stuff online with Faithful to God, and we was known as Soldiers of God. And so it was me, him, Beckel, G-Man, Sister Cherry was in and out among us, G-Con. It was that whole group. And they had invited me in when they found out that I had left the Black Israelite movement, and I had done the first interview with Adam Coleman on True ID podcast, because it was a whole big deal when I left and blah, 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 because I was just well known because of the music and stuff like that. So, and after they heard me speak, then they reached out to me and was like, hey, use your help, blah, 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 you can kind of, join us and blah, 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 right? I didn't know what a Christian apologist was at that time. And so, but I just knew, hey, I'm already publicly talking about the experience of the Black Israelite movement, and my goal is to see other brothers and sisters come out of that. And so, and I was already, I had that interview with Adam Coleman and things, and here it is, they invite me, then hey, it is what it is, right? I told him at that time, hey, if this goes left and I'm out. I told him that from the get-go, right? But so we continued on. We spent hours and hours and hours and hours, stream after stream after stream, talking about Deuteronomy 28 and all these things. A lot of y'all might remember that. Behind the scenes, though, because I'm just learning about everybody. I didn't know who they were. So, I'm interacting with everybody, blah, blah, blah. And behind the scenes is all discombobulated, see? where you have in the midst of that one group, open theists, people that don't believe God knows all things, right? You have people who believe God knows all things, so they're infighting behind the scenes, but before everyone else is like, you know, we're the band of Christians. Like, bro, y'all. So you have various different things, right? And so behind the scenes, like, hey, listen, bro, this ain't right. We need to be on one accord, bro. You got this person over here don't believe God knows all things. This person believe God knows all things. This person over here scared to correct this woman pastor because she changed his diapers and when he was growing up. And then you got this person over here that's vehemently against women pastors. Y'all don't even agree. Y'all believe each other's out of order and all this stuff. But before everybody else, we're the band of Christians going against the Black Hebrew Israelites. When I saw that, and I try to have multiple conversations behind the scenes about that, y'all saw I didn't do no more. I pulled out. And then shortly after that, then things turned to the Brother J podcast and all that stuff. Because I already had that channel already a little bit. Because Faithful had actually recommended that I had started a channel on YouTube or wherever, can put some stuff over there. So we was already kind of doing that. And then as I began to then break away because all those disagreements and people just being fine with not being one, that's when y'all saw I didn't do anything more with them. But but from that time up to this time, it's been the same reoccurring issue over and over again, which is this perceived unity and these collaborations that's taking place before everyone else, and everybody's like, it's about the Bible, it's about the Bible. But behind the scenes, they think each other are heretics. They think people they going infighting, people out of order, all this stuff. And I don't want to be part of that. That's fakery to me. And not just to me, it's just fakery, period. It's fakery when you think someone's a heretic behind the scenes, an idolater or whatever, and then you will collab with them and act like y'all brothers and unified and all this stuff. Like, that's fakery. Y'all just faking with each other. You won't break bread with each other because you think each other are heretics. but hey, this person got that information, this person did them sources, and come bring it all together because we got a common goal of, and nobody care about all that, bro. I don't care about that. And so it's the same thing. And so there's this clear disagreement, and I'm using this Christmas thing as an example because it happened again, where even if you think I'm wrong, right? Even if you think I'm wrong, you have to understand that what you think I'm wrong about, in this case, that, Christmas pagan and blah, blah, you have to understand that the person who thinks it's wrong also thinks and believes you're committing idolatry. You're creating idolatry, you're following the ways of pagans, and so they're trying to, like, in their brain, you're wrong, you're going the wrong way, bro, and they're trying to correct you. All right? So this is what you got to know about the person that you think is wrong about what they're saying. You got to also remember what they're saying is based upon what they think and believe in their minds and consciences. Okay? And so since they believe that, y'all don't have the peace between y'all two as you ought, because this person, when they look at you and what you're doing, they're vexed in their souls about you because they believe you're going the way of idolatry. So all their alarms is going off. And like, well, I got to help my brother. While the brother they're trying to help is, it ain't that, it ain't this, it ain't that, excuse after excuse, we're going to do it anyway. The Bible doesn't explicitly say. Okay, fine, you can say that. But you got to understand that y'all don't got no peace, though. So just saying we brothers, bro, that's just words. All right? That's just words, man. But when the person comes to you, and I'm not even talking about openly, I mean privately, come to you and say, hey, listen, we need to deal with this issue here. And then it's pushed to the side. And then you say, well, I want to, okay, well, I wanted us to, collab on something we agree with. You got to understand what that does. You gotta understand what that does. There's no urgency to actually deal with the matter. Instead, though there's a vital disagreement, okay, a vital one, yet, nah, man, hey, let's make this content about topics we agree on. That's the problem. See? It's that type of mindset right there. That's the problem. That's persistent among Christian apologists. It's consistent even when you read church history. Okay? That's a consistent problem to where now there's this idea that it's okay to disagree. That's where this non-essential essentials thing come from. It's okay to disagree, except on certain topics. Okay? But the things that are considered essentials. And every person that brings that up, I tell people all the time, the apostles didn't live by that code, brothers and sisters. When they were setting up these churches, okay, I know people act like the apostles weren't on like 100% one accord about doctrines, but they were still brothers and still laborers, and they just continued the mission. So that's some pattern they set for us. You won't find ever in the entirety of your Bibles them ever disagreeing on any doctrine, not one. You will find an example of Paul withstanding Peter, not because Peter's preaching a false doctrine verbally or that he's promoting, but because of his fear of the circumcision party in the moment, got up and withdrew from the table of the Gentiles, therefore offending everybody, and his actions wasn't in accordance to the good news. So Paul withstood him to his face. They weren't disagreeing about doctrine. Peter knew the truth and he agreed with it, but his fear of the circumcision party had him in his actions act hypocritically. That's why Paul withstood him to his face. The situation with John Mark. They didn't disagree about no doctrine. Paul was upset and didn't want to take John Mark with them because he abandoned them in the mission that they had before that. This had nothing to do with Paul preaching a certain thing, but John Mark don't believe that. He don't believe that. So they're just like, hey, you know what? We're still brothers, even though we disagree. Stop it. You won't find one disagreement between any of the Lord's apostles doctrinally. That whole idea that everybody can just disagree, but as long as we agree about certain things, we brothers, that's later on. Post-apostles. Okay? Post-apostles. So, but this is what it's come to, because that thought is one of the things that happens that slowly drifts people away from Christ. Because guess what? As time goes on, and here's this one matter, hey, it's okay. We don't got to agree about everything. It's just as long as we agree about certain things. Then as the future generations come and disagree about more things, it's okay that we disagree about more things than the previous generations, but as long as we agree about these kind of leftover things we all retain to, then, we all brothers. Then the later generations come and they agree about more things than the previous generation. But it's okay because the pattern has been set that it's okay to not agree about everything and not believe all the same things. But as long as we agree about some certain things, then, we're all Christians. And then that just continued to grow and grow and grow further and further away from what the apostles laid down when they said, be of one mind, believing the same things, speaking the same things, being of unity in intent and in purpose, defending the faith together by the way that y'all live unifiably. If I can make up a new word, I don't know if that's a real word, but unifiably. See, where you don't have Christians over here in violence, but they still Christians. It's okay, we disagree with them, but they got fight ministries. And then over here, this band of Christians is like, no, that's murder. That's not right. The way it was supposed to be is both sides. So whether you go see Christians over there or you travel over here and see Christians, the way that they're acting, since they're all part of Christ's body and Christ is just one person, he had one image and one character that was just holy, you see holy living over here, and over here the same kind of holy living because it's one person, Jesus. Okay? Not a version of Jesus over here, and then you go over there and there's a different version of Jesus over here. That's not what the Lord established through his apostles. It was supposed to be one version of Jesus over here. You walk over here and see that same version of Jesus. Walk over there and see the same version of Jesus. Walk over there and see the same version of Jesus. So that no matter where people are in the world, those in darkness will see the same kind of light and then come to it. That's what the Lord was establishing. But that's not, how the world is now, which is proof that the great falling away had already began subtly during the time of the apostles in them, as wolves started to creep in, as the apostle said. And then as the years grew, it just got worse and worse. And when the man of lawlessness was revealed, and everything that happened in Rome happened, it just exponentially grew. Okay. And yes, the truth of the gospel is still in the world. You can't really get rid of it. The true image of Christ is, yes, it's still in the world. And many people had the faith in imitating that. And the Lord is dragging his people out of falsehoods and saving their souls. And they're imitating Christ. So the true image of Christ is everywhere in the world. But it's only a remnant of it. The image of Christ that you see plastered more publicly and more readily available is a fake Jesus. It's not the real Jesus. Okay? The common way that's known throughout the world, you look in America, that you can see plastered on TV commercials and the images that follow with them, all of that is a byproduct of the fall away. Okay? When you look at the things Christ established through his apostles and the fact that those things were separate from the world and the world hated those things, so they didn't join in those things, the things we see now plastered all over the world that the world is ready to join believers in did not come from the Lord, came from men. Okay? And so as I see these things more and more and more, it vexes the soul. But there was something that happened last night that I came across, which inspired today's class. And so we're going to go over these things. But let me look at this right here. Grace and peace to everybody that's joining in right here. Our Father is the uncreated Holy Spirit. Our Father is the one person who said, "Let there be light." Our Father created by his word. Our Father took on flesh, and Jesus is the avatar of his incarnation. I get the whole idea about avatar. I get it. Probably not the best words to use because, yeah. So I want to use this as an example, though. All right, is that another point when we put into practice what the Lord talks about when he says through his apostles, he says, be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to get angry, and things like that, because human anger don't produce the righteousness of God. I want to use this as an example, right? By just reading this, if I was just read this and just like respond, the first thing is like, bruh, Jesus is the avatar, like, and you just kind of go down this whole rabbit hole, right? But let me walk through what he said, see what I agree about, and see where the point of contention could possibly arise, but how to rectify all of this, all right? Because let me do this right quick. Let me put this on the screen while I'll be doing this. Okay. I just want to pull up the definition of avatar. I just want to put that up since he's using that term. All right. Now, let's see. How can I let me put it over here? Here we go. All right. So when somebody says avatar, right? For those who saw the movie Avatar, like I saw that, right, years ago. And that was actually one of my favorite movies, right? Obviously, when I found out that these things were anti-Christ, the theaters and the things that they're doing, and my eyes were open to the fact that even though they got all these CGI effects and it looks so cool and things like that, the things they're doing from the magical, heathenistic elements and the whole idea of the Avatar and the doctrines, obviously, that the movie would teach, and the fact that people are acting out the things that God says don't do. I understood that these things were actually contrary to Christ. And then later on, when I found out that the church, the apostles and the early Christians, they literally avoided the theaters because of this reason, so that they don't become corrupt in their thinking and thoughts through these hypocrites, where we get the word hypocrite or actor from, these pretenders, when they're putting on the images of demons or devils, and they're acting out the works of the devil and things like that to tell stories, but they're imitating those acts. And so the Christians avoided these places. And so when I saw that only further confirmed it, obviously, because that showed that the Holy Spirit is the one who drew me out of that, because now I'm realizing that coming out from the midst of them, which the Holy Spirit brought me out without having knowledge of what the church did at the time. When I did find out what the church did at the time, that that it is proof that it was the Lord who had mercy and put me out of these things so I may be pure, but and continue to grow in purity. But when somebody used avatar, so I saw the video, right? Now you'll see avatar, it got two meanings, right? Here. In Hinduism, which is not Christianity, right? But in Hinduism, avatar, a manifestation of a deity or released soul in bodily form on earth. An incarnate divine teacher. I'm gonna leave that highlight. The second usage of it here, an icon or figure representing a particular person in video games, internet forums, etc. So it's not the person, but it's a figure of the person. Okay, it's a figure of the person. And so what people need to understand, and this is what idols would be, right? So idols, all idols like Bastet, Ra, Thor, Odin, all these idols that people worship, those idols that they made, when the scripture said don't make any graven image, those idols that they made wasn't the actual God. It was a figure representing the God. Okay. And Yahweh, who speaks from heaven, let us know that not only do we hate the idea of people worshiping demons and calling them gods to be worshiped, but he hates the very idea of human beings making figures of what they think God is like. So that's why he said, don't make any graven images of anything that you see in the heavens above, the earth beneath, under the earth, whether it be animal, men, beast, object, whatever it is. Do not use any of these things that you see to then make an image and saying, this is what I'm like. This is a figure of God or Yahweh. And so, meaning God wanted mankind to understand that his true form was like the wind, invisible. Therefore, no images. But God, in his plan, when he said, let us make man in our image to be like us, planned to become visible. So therefore, as scripture said, God has prepared a body for me. And here comes God incarnate in human flesh. And therefore, the scripture said Christ is the visible image or icon, if you want to say, or figure of the invisible God. Christ is not the invisible God. And I'm talking about the human form. For anybody running to the hills, the human form, which is the Son of Man, is not the invisible God. He is the invisible God incarnate in human flesh. So naturally speaking, God is not a human at all. Naturally speaking, God don't got no physical human earthly flesh and blood body, but he takes on that form. So Christ is the visible image of the invisible God, meaning God is invisible always. But he has a visible representation or visible image or visible icon that he himself put on the earth. Not humans. What will God like? Let's make a human being. No, God created a body himself with his own hands. His Holy Spirit incarnate that actual body that could talk and move without human beings moving it around like all other idols is. But instead, he lived, breathed, talked, moved around, thought, did miracles. So now it goes from what idols are, which can't breathe or talk or help you. So now you have this visible icon made by God himself. And when I say made by God himself, I'm not saying that Jesus Christ, according to divine nature, was created. I'm not saying that. I'm talking about his body that clearly wasn't there in the beginning. His human form was made. Just as Christ himself attested. Thou hast prepared a body for me. You can't say that about an eternal spirit. You prepared an eternal spirit. No, he's always existed. But his body did not always exist. His body came into existence. Okay? So here it is, the invisible God that has no beginning comes into a human body that has a beginning. The human body has a beginning. It has a birth date. It has a time where it came into the physical realm. But the spirit in that body has no beginning. He's eternal. This is why we say Christ is fully God and fully man. That fully man part has a beginning. Okay? That fully man part got a beginning. So, and that physical, that fully man part, or that flesh and blood that he took on, is the visible image of the invisible God. Just as God said in the beginning, let us make man, flesh and blood, in our image, to be like us. Okay. So this body was the temple or the house of the eternal spirit. All right. Just like any temple is. All right. The temple itself is not the invisible spirit that's behind the veil. Okay. Yet it's still one with the invisible spirit behind the veil, because that temple is that invisible spirit's body. And you can't worship the eternal spirit while rejecting his body. It's impossible. You got to accept the totality of the person. All right. You can only get to the eternal spirit behind the veil by passing through the temple, meaning the body. All right. And so this is why Christ said, no man can come to the Father but by me. Christ is the temple of the eternal spirit, the fullness of the Godhead dwelt bodily in Christ. The human man, Jesus, the flesh and blood body, is not the invisible spirit. That's why he says, the Father's greater than I am. And that's why he's praying to the eternal spirit. Okay. Because he's subject to things in a fully human form that the eternal spirit can never be subject to, like death, like temptation to sin. Okay. So understanding that though Christ and God is one, and this mystery between the unity of the divine nature and this human nature, nevertheless, the human nature is subject to the divine nature. All right. Always. Flesh is always subject to spirit. So when the brother used the term avatar, I know what he's saying. All right. I know people run to the hills and get crazy about it, but I wanted to pull up what it meant. I don't use the word avatar. It's going to cause way too many problems. But nevertheless, if we're going to just go by what the word means instead of getting up in arms about it stuff, where it says an icon or figure representing a particular person in video games, internet forums, etc., or a manifestation of a deity or released soul in bodily form on earth, an incarnate divine teacher, then I ain't gonna have too many arguments against what this person said when they use the word avatar. Okay. Now you have the physical body and you have the eternal spirit coming into one. All right, coming into one. So he's fully God, fully man. And so the fully man part is subject to things that the fully God part can never be subject to, like death, like temptation to sin, like I said, getting tired, being hungry, people being able to choke him up or beat him up. Like you can't do that to the eternal spirit. You can treat the temple that way or the physical body, but you cannot treat the eternal spirit that way. But because the temple itself is the house of the eternal spirit, this is why Christ says, what you do to the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you do unto me. Though you never physically beat up Christ, but if you beat up his temple, it's like beating up Christ himself. Okay. Christ ain't got no bruises on him, literally, from you doing harm to your neighbor, but your neighbor that is his house does. So you have to show honor to both the temple and the spirit, and it shows what you think of the spirit by how you treat his body. All right. So, and this is why the apostle going to how you should love your brethren, and those who hate their brethren have no eternal life, because if you dishonor Christ's body, how can you say you love Christ? You only show honor to the spirit based upon how you treat his body. All right. And that's why murder is so bad, because they're destroying the body, but it's because they hate the soul of the person, the spirit of the person. They hate them. All right. All sin begins in the heart. All right. But you can't choke, you can't stab, you can't shoot in the head a spirit, but you can do it to their body. All right. And so that's why the scripture talk about the murder and all that stuff. But the point is, I'm using that as an example to say, and when you look at Christian history, a lot of times, and this is facts, a lot of the wars and infights that took place and when people got, killed and things like that by other Christians, is because they didn't agree upon how to explain something. They were believing the same thing, but when they went to explain it, they started bickering over words usages. And now they're fighting. And those fights lead to one party wanting to have the dominance of thought. And since they have, kings on their side, or they have the government at their whim, now that you got political leaders that profess to be Christians and those things, they will use war and conquest to state their claim about what they want, how they want something to be explained, even though the people both believe the same thing, which is weird, right? So, and we see even remnants of that still to this day. But nevertheless, I'm just using that as an example. The person put the comment on there, so I want to use that as an example to talk about it. So, is that the eternal spirit within the body is the eternal God. That's why the scripture says, your creator, who is spirit, came into the world he created. By what? becoming human or taking on human form. So he has his own form, truly, which is outside of human form, but he takes on human form. So you can say God has two forms, an invisible form and a visible form. But the visible form is the weaker form because it's the form that could be that could have been subject to death and people hurting it. That's the form that got tired. Jesus slept. Jesus wept. All these experiences as a human, because that human form is the form that would be the high priest to lead God's other flesh and blood children to the eternal kingdom. And so only as a human could he die and suffer, and through that be qualified to be our eternal high priest, merciful and faithful. So that was important. So now, that ain't the point of this class, but I only use that as an example about what it is that I am going to get into. All right. So is Christ God manifesting human flesh? Yes. Yes. That human form, though, had to be glorified and exalted. It was given authority. It was these things that just are naturally God's. He gave to the Son, or gave to the human man Jesus, because, well, at one point, the human man was not, even though the eternal spirit that's in the body of Christ always was. The human man came in time. The spirit that came in that body preceded time. All right. That's why I say God, your creator, came in or became human. All right. So Christ ain't a regular human. All right. For anybody who's talking about he ain't God and stuff. So he is God. All right. Manifesting human form. But there is a distinction between the humanity that's fully man and then the divinity, which is fully God. And there's a marriage between the two. And then by way of his death and conquering the grave and inheriting immortality for mankind, when he rose from the grave and rose into eternal life, never to die again, then you have this unifying in a total sense of divine and body, or human, or mankind, where now you no longer have this carnal flesh and blood form, but now you've been given a heavenly body as God desired, or an incorruptible form. And so it's not the same as this form right now. And so that's why we're waiting to see what we shall be like when Christ appears. But nevertheless, now there's this full or totality union between the body, or the lamb, all right, the body of Christ, and the divine, because now God's plan is completed to make man in his image to be like us. So now, not only in character are you like God, but now you have a form that won't be able to be tempted by sin. You won't be able to sin. All right, that's coming more like God now in a totality fulfillment sense. But also now you're immortal, as God has always been. And God achieved that for us by sending Christ into a human body in order to accomplish that for us. So now, with that being the case, that same God who manifested human flesh came down with teachings and handed it down to his apostles to then teach other believers. And there's something that his apostles said that I want to read before we get into the thing I want to bring up. Okay. And this is in Philippians verse, let's see here, make sure I'm at the right place here. Make sure I got the right tab. Just give me a quick second here. I think I messed it up when I was thing, but I'll pull it back up. All right. All right. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, the apostle said this. Let me put this on the screen so y'all can see. I'm gonna start at verse 13 actually. But and of course, if anybody got any questions, let me know. But in the chat section there. But 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, starting at verse 13, the apostle said this. As for us, we can't help but thank God for you, brothers and sisters, loved by the Lord. We are always thankful that God chose you to be among the first to experience salvation. A salvation that came through the Spirit who makes you holy and through your belief in the truth. He called you to salvation when we told you the good news. Now you can share in the glory of our Lord Jesus Christ. With all these things in mind, dear brothers and sisters, stand firm and keep a strong grip on the teaching we passed on to you, both in person and by letter. Okay? So there's a warning and an exhortation that, hey, hold on with a strong grip. You do not let go, not even a little bit. When you're talking about a strong grip, you're talking about clenching. Clenching so tight, you don't let none of it go. You don't let none of your grip go. He said, keep a strong grip on the teaching we passed on to you, both in person and by letter. So that lets us know, okay, that when it comes to the truths about Christ, who he is, and whom the apostles said he is, that they handed down, it's important not to let those things go. Not one bit of it. Okay? So you don't have room. If you keep it a tight grip, and the apostle said that he is your creator incarnate in human form. If you're holding a tight grip to that, then there's no room to lightly let go to where you say, well, he's still the Son of God, but he's not the most high God. He's not the creator. Once you do that, your grip has gotten weak. There's no space. If they hand it down and say, hey, listen, grace teaches us to deny ungodliness and worldly lust and be sober and righteous in this present world. Hold a tight grip to that. Don't let it go. Then that means you don't have room to lighten your grip. And to where now it's like, okay, yeah, Jesus Christ came and I believe that, but you know, fighting ain't that bad. It's just a game. You don't have your grip is getting weak. Somebody might come and say, well, it's okay, your grip weak. We're not all going to hold strong grip. It's okay. Somebody might come and say that, but they're making excuses for letting the strong grip go. If you're holding a tight grip to what the apostles gave us, you don't have space to go to the left or the right or to become lax in something that they handed to us. Okay? And so, he said, hold a strong grip to the traditions, to the teachings. So what this means is not only should we know what they taught, we also need to know how did they apply it, the teachings. Because however they applied the teachings during the time of the apostles, okay, from their verbal teachings to the way of life that those people who were being taught by the apostles lived, that's what we're to hold to. Any other versions where people are letting go of their grips, and now, they got a couple of things they're holding on to still, but they've let go of other things. It's important that you regain your grip. Okay? And you can't regain your grip by referring to generations of people who was letting go of the grip. You can't hold tight to the grip while referring to generations that was letting go of the grip. So what the 6th century, what the 5th century, what the 4th century, what the 3rd century, late 2nd into 3rd century, the things that they did, reading everything that they did, you can't rely upon that to know whether you are holding to the strong grip that you should be holding to. Because syncretization came in, Christianization came in, you had the whole Constantine conversion debacle, you had all these things that came in through these time periods. You got the myths, you got the legends, you got all these type of things that began to happen. You had the slow formation of the Roman Catholic Church and the Pope power. You had all this stuff happening during these time periods. You can't refer to generations where the grip was being not held on so strong to then justify how you in the 21st century ought to live. You ought to use the writings of the apostles. That's why scriptures is the highest authority above every person. The letters that we got from them, the things that they said, that, and then any ounce of evidence that we can have from their time and the believers that followed them. Okay? Not a disciple of a disciple of a disciple that followed him. No, the people that followed them. Because these same apostles, like Paul, for example, said, hey, there are going to be people who are my disciples, who are the disciple of my disciples, that will be wolves and lead people astray. So you can't just use the authority argument or the sensation argument, because the same people said, hey, there's going to be those from your very own number that's going to lead people astray. Wolves, not sparing the flock, even among your own number. So you can't go, well, this guy was a disciple of the Apostle Paul, and then he trained this disciple. So he's the disciple of the disciple Paul. That don't mean anything if he didn't hold a strong grip. See? If he's holding on to a lot of things, but letting go of some things, we can't rely 100% on him to determine whether or not we are holding on a tight grip. We could just be holding on with the same weak grip he was having. Okay. So when we talk about the teachings of Christ, the law of God that's firm throughout all generations, when it comes to how you should love your neighbor and love your enemy and all these things, the gospel message of Jesus Christ that stands firm throughout all generations, even though you got corruptors of it, but the truth of it's always remained because we still have the writings of the original foundation layers, meaning the apostles of Jesus Christ. The ones who laid the foundation, we had their testimonies of Christ. So when we look at church history and we see people letting go certain things that the apostle said, we have the actual foundation layers letters to compare to them. The things that those foundation layers said. We have writings of people who testified about how the Christians lived during those foundation layers time period. Not post them, but during them. All right? Just as people who account about Jesus Christ and the validity of the crucifixion. Okay? Because they're talking about the actual time of Jesus. And we have those same type of things regarding the apostle of Jesus. So the apostle said, hey, hold a strong grip on the teaching we passed on to you both in person and by letter. Okay? Because as it was starting out, we know they didn't have the Bible at this time. So the way they were passing on doctrine was when they were in town, they were literally teaching to the people. When they were far away, they would write letters. Okay? So that's what he's talking about there. Now, those letters obviously were comprised over a time period, and now we have what we call the Bible, which is the written down form of what they taught them orally and in written form as well. Okay. As time went on, and obviously if you play the telephone game, y'all know how it is. Things get switched up real fast. So it's important that oral things are written down. So now I started by reading that because yesterday, obviously on Facebook friends with different apologists, and the brother Jim Green had shared this thing here. I don't know why it jumped like that. Hold on, what happened? It's like it left the page. I'm like, what is it? All right, hold on. Let's see if I can get back to it. All right. He had shared this, and him and another brother they had a live stream the other day about Christmas and stuff. And I had came in there and, was trying to let them know about the whole birthdays thing and all of that. So I told him to reach out to me privately so we can set up a time to actually go over that information because obviously there's ignorance about this. And so he was the one who reached out to me and talking about, us doing some work together and stuff. But so later on, he had shared this post because the brother that was with him did his own live stream, which y'all see right there. Christmas is not pagan, prove me wrong. Season finale, whatever. And so, so I click on to see what, see what he would say. And now you guys won't be able to hear this because I'm outside and it's not running through my board, but I just wanted to show you guys, like, this was the live stream. And he's having this conversation with his sister. And now I can hear, but you guys can't hear. But there was a couple of points that he made. And so I wanted to address these things and show you guys something, okay? This is why this topic is so important, because the reasons that this brother rated B by Dre, the evidence that he used to say Christmas ain't pagan, etc., comes from what he quotes is late 2nd century, and he brings up Hippolytus. Okay, bring up Hippolytus, talking about Jesus was born on December 25th. Now we're going to look into that because this is the second time in 2 days that he's mentioned that I've heard him mention that, and so we're going to look at that in a second. But he mentions that. He also makes a statement that says Christmas has never been associated with paganism. Okay, around the 34-minute mark, he says Christmas has never been associated with paganism. Okay, now that's just definitely false, but nevertheless, never been associated with paganism, and that using late 2nd century Hippolytus proves that as late as the 2nd century, people began to commemorate Jesus Christ's birth and kind of celebrate it. Now, what y'all brothers and sisters also understand is that Christmas, even when the idea first came up, this was not a worldwide thing. This wasn't it wasn't even a Christian worldwide thing. This was kind of like imagine this, you got 30 churches and like one church over there decide they want to do something new, and then they have an influence. The other church kind of like what they did, so then that church adopts it, and then a third church, a fourth church, a fifth church does it, but the other churches like, nah, we ain't doing that. All right, then another church over there kind of like, oh man, we kind of like that, so then they adopt. Like, that's how the whole Christmas thing happened. And then when you had the Church of Rome adopt that, and then Constantine converts, quotation mark, to Christianity, and then Christianity becomes the empire's religion, they used imperial power to enforce December 25th, which is what the Western church was doing for Jesus' birth. All right. And then that became the worldwide established day of Christ's birth, even though you have certain churches, remnant-wise, in the Eastern world that still do the whole January 6th thing. But but on a worldwide scale, the reason why the majority of the world does December 25th is because the imperial power and influence of Rome. Okay, that's why. And so understanding that, even when the Christmas idea came up and they started trying to calculate births and stuff, this was like it was like a obscure bunch of leaders over there in the corner of a church. It wasn't no council that came together that established this. There was nothing like that. It wasn't a council. It wasn't ecumenical. It wasn't anything like that. It was just some obscure people over there in the corner came up with the idea, started speculating. That church over there was like, oh, we kind of like that. They start doing it. Third church kind of like it. The other church is like, nah, we ain't doing that. All right. And then as time went on, and then one particular location got imperial power through governmental, strategy and stuff like that. Then that became, then their influence is what became what is the worldwide version we got today. So y'all need to understand that's how this happened, okay? So there wasn't one particular edict that said, hey, today is the day you're gonna, it was none of that, okay? But you do have different writings from different people kind of speculating the dates about Christ's birth, but that was an obscure type of personal endeavors that those men had. It wasn't something that was going on worldwide, Christian-wide, okay? So this is important to understand that. All right. Now, but he was making these statements, and he brought up Hippolytus and things like that. So now, he also said, now I want to show you some screenshots from the comment section. All right. Here we go. So he made a statement during his podcast, and a person that was listening, Jesus Saves, re-quoted it in his comment section, or referred to it, and said it was an excellent point. And this, so far, I've heard the Dre brother say it. I've heard him and Brother Jim Green say it the other night, and I've heard this chaplain. I forgot his name though, but chaplain. They call him the chaplain, and he said it as well. And I think I've heard Inspired Philosophy say it as well. But you hear this kind of the shift in talk where they say, we're not celebrating a birthday or the birthday of Jesus. We're celebrating the incarnation. All right. Now, I addressed that a little bit in the previous podcast, but I'm going to address this a little bit more today, this particular point. It says an excellent point. Right. Now, and then the same person later on says, all right, let me get back to it here. Let me see if I can find it right quick. I think it was this one. Nope, not that one. Is it this one? All right. It said, I think most people that reject Christmas is really because they reject the deity of Jesus. And the brother Dre hearted it. All right. And obviously, we know when you like and heart something, you share the same sentiment. So that the idea is that most people that reject the Feast of Christmas is really because they reject the deity of Jesus. So now this celebrating Christmas becomes associated with accepting the deity of Jesus, like it's a badge of showing you believe in the deity of Jesus. Okay. So now this is the level that those who are pro-Christmas make it. Now they talk about, us saying it's idolatry and all these other things is wrong. But then at the same time, on the other end, they're thinking that celebrating this is some badge that you believe Jesus Christ's deity, and the people who are against it is because they really reject the deity of Jesus. Like, I probably spent, 20 minutes at the beginning of this live stream talking about the deity of Jesus. And I'm definitely anti-Christmas. Okay. And so this foolish idea that those who, oppose Christmas and talk about the whole paganism and all paganism and stuff, is somehow they really reject the deity of Jesus. That's why they don't want to do it. That's utter foolishness. Here's why. Remember what the passage I read? It said, hold tight to the teachings, or some translations say traditions, that we handed down to you, whether by oral or by words. So not only should we take into account what they said, but also how they applied. Now, when people open up the Bible, okay, whether you read the Old Testament or the New Testament, the people who are anti, and even people who are pro, and I'm going to show you evidence of this, all right? Matter of fact, let me go ahead and put that on the screen right now. This is an article by a pro-Christmas minister, all right? If Jesus wasn't born on December 25th, why do we call it his birthday? And he's going through the historical accounts to make the point, right? Now, at the end, he says, regardless of these things, he don't think there's anything wrong with it, blah, 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 blah. So I'm not pulling from a source that's like anti. This is a pro source, okay? And I want to show you guys what he said. This is a person that's pro it. He does it. Got no problem with it. But he's accounting, historically speaking, things about the apostles and their generation, which is the generation we need to be looking at, because the apostles them laid the foundation and told their generation, hold a strong grip to what we handed down to you, whether by word or by letter. So let's see what the people during the apostles' day were taught, which then will result in them holding on to it. So we can see their mindset, insight into their mindsets about things that apostles told them about or told them to hold on to. All right. So the question is here, why then do we celebrate his birth on December 25th? And this is what the pro-Christian person said. He said, indeed, why do we celebrate his birth at all? Not just about the date, but why do we even celebrate his birth at all? Then it says the early church did not. They did not. They didn't celebrate his birth date. They didn't celebrate his birth at all. All right, that's what he's saying. Indeed, why do we celebrate his birth at all? The early church did not. For 3 centuries, it did not. So for 3 centuries, 100 years, right? I'm not wrong. All right, somebody correct me if I'm wrong about that. But I believe a decade is 100 years. So for 300 years, okay, the church did not. All right. Now, you might have had within that 300 years, as I said, how Christmas developed, it was some like obscure leaders over in the corner somewhere at like one church or 2 churches, and they started speculating about things. And then another church liked what they were doing and they kind of accepted it, but it wasn't something that was like Christian worldwide. It wasn't something all the churches were doing. It wasn't an official church. It wasn't like communion where all the churches were doing communion. So you had a time where all the churches were doing communion because that was handed down by Christ and his apostles, and they were holding a strong grip on that. But then you had some churches started speculating, adding things, which Christmas is one of those things. And there was a point where only a few churches was doing it, while the mass majority of Christians was not. And as time went on, it became more popular. And then when imperial power came into place, it became the official representation of Jesus Christ's birth, is which the world knows as December 25th today. All right. So he says, why do we celebrate his birth at all? The early church did not. For 3 centuries, it did not. The birth of Christ was not of great significance to the Christians of that era. Right. So far, when the apostles say, hey, remember what we taught you, whether by letter or orally, and hold a strong grip to that. That lets us know orally and by letter, the apostles did not emphasize any significance to Jesus Christ's birthday. Okay? They didn't make it a significant thing. They acknowledged he was born, they acknowledged he's God manifest in the flesh, but they did not make it a significant thing to where now it's something that needs to be focused upon and make a feast for and make it some yearly memorial. They didn't do that. Okay? So we know that this wasn't something that they handed down. Nevertheless, there's more than that, because some people could take this and say, well, they just didn't do it, but there was no problem in us doing it. All right? That's another argument that the brother Dre made, that the Bible doesn't condemn, the Bible doesn't say that it's wrong to do it. That's one of the arguments that he makes in this video. All right, but let's keep reading. They did not consider it to be an event for special celebration. Not that they didn't like a good feast from time to time, meaning these people were used to holidays and holy days and things like that. So it wasn't like they were anti-holy days, that's why they didn't do it. Okay, that's the point this pro-Christmas person is making. But it says, and it certainly was not because they thought the Savior's coming into the world was unimportant, because John talks about it, Matthew recounts, like, so they know Jesus Christ was born, they know how he was born through the Virgin Mary and all these things. They know it, but yet they still not making no significance about it, and they're totally avoiding it as a feast or memorial. All right, remember, Paul said, hold on to what we taught to y'all, whether it be orally or by letter. Then it said, and certainly it was not because they thought the Savior's coming to the world was unimportant. On the contrary, from the earliest days, they regarded every Sunday as the Lord's Day, which you read about in Acts. And with shared fellowship meals, they celebrated his resurrection from the dead, which you see in Acts. So this is something that apostles handed down orally and by letter. And they were holding tight to that. You see that in the book of Acts. Succeeding generations of Christians celebrated Easter with enough fervency that by the mid-2nd century, there was a controversy between the Eastern and Western churches regarding the day and manner of the celebration, which is called the got the word. I think it's called the quarter-deciman controversy. Okay, the quarter-deciman controversy. That's what he's referring to right now. All right, where they were arguing about when you should celebrate the Lord's Passover, which was a stupid argument in the first place. All right, Christ said, "As often as you gather together," but they were arguing about the time frame. You know, and so one group was like, we're going to try to keep it on, we're trying to keep it on the 14th of Nisan. And another group is like, no, we keep it on this day. And now they're arguing over that. That's what the quarter-deciman controversy was. Okay. So the church was already, since the time of the apostles, remembering the Lord's death through what's called the communion. The communion. Okay. And while they were doing communion, there was no feast called Easter. They were doing communion, which already commemorated the Lord's death. Later on, people decided they want to have what's called Easter. So Easter became a developed feast in the churches. It was not handed down by the apostles. They handed down a way for all the churches without controversy to remember the Lord's death, which is the Lord's communion. But then men decided to add in their own traditions, make a separate feast to celebrate Jesus Christ's death. Then comes this controversy. Okay? It's so annoying. So in the Christian world, you have two things remembering or commemorating the Lord's death and resurrection: the actual communion that was handed down, and then the man-made feast Easter, where we got this controversy involved even till this modern time with bunnies and eggs and all that kind of stuff. Okay, stay with the Lord's communion, keep yourself out of controversies. All right, but anyway, so it says, it was a serious enough issue that the age of Polycarp, Bishop of Smyrna, made a 3,000-mile round trip to Rome in AD 155 to make sure the differences between the churches on this issue did not disrupt the unity and communion between them. See, and this is the problem. When the apostles handed down communion to remember the Lord's death, there was no controversy. There was unity. We see in Acts, they held tight to the apostles' doctrine, and there wasn't a needy person among them, and there was no infightings. But as soon as men want to start adding in their own thing, and now you get these theological debates, striving over words. This person want to institute this feast, this person don't. They're arguing, bickering back and forth. It become a big controversy. Now you got to have a whole council to try to settle the matter, and whoever got the highest votes wins. Okay. Then you have these things begin to happen, and now you got to settle these stupid disputes. And so, but it says, after Polycarp's martyrdom and with the rise of persecution, the churches inaugurated a feast, or started a feast, that honored the apostles and commemorate the martyrs. So that means when the apostles of Jesus Christ were living, even after Stephen was born, there was no feast for Stephen. There was no feast of martyrs. There was none of that during the time of Paul. People were dying. The church grieved, but they were to not grieve like the Gentiles did, like people who had no hope. But they didn't make no festivals in honor of Stephen or this person that was a martyr, or the martyr that Christ referenced in Revelation. There was no feast established during this time period to honor these people. They were just martyrs. The people knew they were martyrs, but there was no holiday. There was no feast. There was no All Saints Day, All Souls Day. There was no Halloween. There was no Jesus Christ's birthday. There was no Easter. There was none of that. Okay? This is what was going on during the time when the apostle said, hold a strong grip to what we pass down to you orally or by letter. Okay? We're getting insight into this. So now when you read the book of Acts, You don't see no infighting until those, until those Pharisees came in with that Judaizer doctrine, and now you got to have the Council of Acts 15. And then later on, you had those who saying Jesus Christ didn't come in the flesh, and now you got to argue against them. Then you got so you see the wolves coming in as you progress reading the New Testament, and the apostles got to deal with these different matters. But when they laid the foundation of the church and handed down the ordinances that Christ said to do, there was no infighting. There was no council that needed to take place to handle any disputes or anything like that. As everybody was holding on to the apostles' doctrine, and there was no issue where this church believed women could be pastors, but this church was not, and they're arguing over the interpretation of what the apostle Paul meant in 1 Corinthians or in Titus. Instead, it said, the apostle said, as I teach in all the churches, let the women learn in silence. And they were all holding to the apostles' doctrine. That's why you don't see no council about should women be pastors. Like, that's why you don't see that. All right. So you have these things, but he's going to say something else. He says, the day of birth, this is what he says, but those feasts were invariably associated with deaths, not births. So even the feasts that were added on later on were all centered around around deaths of people, not people's births. Then it says, the day of birth was generally considered to be the least important thing about a person. Meaning during the time of the apostles and the believers during this time period, the day that a person was born into the world was the least important part or thing about a person. All right, now I'm painting this picture because they're preaching these people doctrines, but when you believe a doctrine, it forms your mind, how you think, how you process things, which then influence what you do. So during this time of the apostles, as they're handing down things orally and by letter, they're teaching the believers to not make a deal about birthdays, which the Gentiles around them were doing, but they were not to do that. That is the least important thing about a person, and they taught the people that making a deal about that day stems from superstition and pagan idolatry. That's what they were teaching. Okay, so now they're about to say this. It says, the day of birth is generally considered to be the least important thing about a person. Origen of Alexandria, the most influential theologian of the third century, this is important because this brother quoted Hippolytus of the late 2nd century going to the 3rd century. Depending on what source you read, it'll say 3rd century. So Origen and Hippolytus would have been during the same generation. Okay? But anyway, or around about same generation. But it ain't too far from one another, late 2nd century, early 3rd century. All right? That's not too far from one another. But the point is, Origen of Alexandria, the most influential theologian of the 3rd century, thought that the whole idea of celebrating their birthday was a pagan thing that Christians should have nothing to do with, and that only godless men like Pharaoh and Herod celebrated their birthdays. He's not the only one who shared that same thought. So now you see during the same time period where these guys are pulling sources and going, actually, Hippolytus of the late 2nd century, all right, believed that December 25th was Jesus' birth. Okay, during the same time period, there was a super influential theologian named Origen, for example, who said only sinners celebrate births. So what would that Origen thought of Hippolytus in his argument about December 25th? See? So that's the issue that we have here, is that people are like, it's like using a writing today of some minister, let's say, even though he's dead and gone now, but let's say John MacArthur wrote an article, all right? And in this article, he's proclaiming there's nothing wrong with attending the Olympics because we can use that as a platform for Jesus. And then somebody 15 years from now uses that as a reference to make excuses during their generation for Christians participating in the pagan Olympics that is done in the worship of Apollo, okay? Even till this very day. And he uses John MacArthur's letter to justify Christians participating in that, all right? And then, hold on. There's another preacher during the same generation named Pastor J, who wrote an entire epistle and letter telling brothers and sisters how attending these places that are done in honor of, there's pagan immorality and done in honor of false gods and stuff, that this is contrary to your water baptism. It's contrary to Christ. It's antichrist. So now you got one person saying ain't nothing wrong with that. We can use this as a platform for Jesus. The other part saying if you do that, you're departing from the faith. Who are you going to believe? None of us, John MacArthur or myself, none of us are the foundation layers of the faith. We're just builders who build upon it. We're not the foundation layers. What did the foundation layers say about such matter? What did they teach the believers? How did they live so that we can contrast what John MacArthur is saying and what Pastor Jay is saying to see who's holding a strong grip to what the apostles laid down as the foundation and the way of life that we should live versus who has let go the grip and where they're kind of holding on to some things, but other things they're not let go. And now they're making excuses for the things they've let go. So who's holding tight? So now when we go back to the foundation layers, and the foundation layers say things like, flee from idolatry, my brothers and sisters. What fellowship does light have with darkness? What fellowship has the temple of God with the temple of Baal? For example, you say something like that. And then you look at the Olympics, for example, and then you can see on TV, they have the lighting ceremony that precedes the main event. And they're sitting in there praying to Apollo, and they light a flame and they put it on the little torch. And then they bring that torch and do the torch relay. And then they bring it to the Olympic Stadium that you see on ABC. And everybody's there, clapping hands. Then they take the Apollo flame and run around the track a couple times, go up to the conundrum and light it up. Now you see this is idolatry. This whole festival is done in honor of idols. Then now you take John MacArthur's article and you take my article. And then you get to see who's the person actually holding strong to what the foundation layers of the church held to versus who has let go the grip. Then you will see in this scenario, John MacArthur has let go. He wasn't holding a strong grip like he should have had. Now it doesn't mean John MacArthur ain't in heaven, all right? Because excuse me, because the apostle talks about how fire will test every man's work, the builders, the teachers, will test his work, excuse me. And the apostles lay down the foundation, but the builders are building upon that, and they're using different materials. Some using hay, some using wood, some using gold and precious jewels. There are things that burn up way quicker. There are things that take longer to burn up, like hay burns way faster than wood, okay? But wood eventually burns. But then when you're using gold and stuff like that, these things that are able to stand the fire, okay? And so the builders, meaning the teachers, some are using good materials, some are using bad materials. But fire will test every man's work, okay? How strong did they hold a grip? Did they hold a grip 80% real tight, but 20% they had wood and hay? God will burn up that wood and hay. But that 80, jewels that they used will be able to stand the test, and they'll receive the appropriate reward for their work. Here's another leader. He used wood and hay, false prophet, leading the people astray. He ain't even walking on the actual foundation. He just saying he believe in Jesus. But he got a whole nother Jesus, whole nother way of life, all these things. When the day of testing comes, all his work will be burnt up. Okay? Then you have those teachers holding tight grip. They're using gold. They're using precious jewels. And so all their work stands. The apostle explains this, all right? Just like how on the receiving end of the good news, you got the good soil, then you got the seed sown among the thorns and thistles, then you got the rocky ground, and then you got the people where the birds came and ate it. Just like that, among the teachers, same thing. You got the good soil teachers, 36 and 100-fold. You got the cares of this world teachers, that all they talk about is prosperity and things like that. The deceitfulness of riches and stuff, it chokes them up. They're not fruitful. That's why their ministries are centered around the things of this world and the things that choke people up. And so then you got the ones, rocky ground, persecution come, everybody go away. Then you got the ones, they're not even able to comprehend because the evil one comes and takes comprehension immediately. So on the receiving end, but you also have that on the teaching end. All right. And so the apostle is talking about that. Now, so this pro-Christmas person is saying that during the time of the apostles and the first 3 centuries of the church, no one, I'm going to read it again. the day of birth was generally considered to be the least important thing about a person, Origen of Alexandria, the most influential theologian of the 3rd century, thought that the whole idea of celebrating a birthday was a pagan thing that Christians should have nothing to do with, and that only godless men like Pharaoh and Herod celebrate their birthdays. So if, for example, if Origen believed that, and then here came some other church father, all right, who said, oh, this is the day of Jesus' birth. We're going to have a birthday celebration to remember his birth. What would have Origen's response been to that church father? He would say, man, only sinners do this. This is paid. This is idolatry. And if that other father continued that way, what would have Origen thought of that father? He would say, he's straight away. Now, while later generations will use that straight away person's writings to make excuses for their continual straying away, people that hold on to like what Origen said here, and hold on, this is idolatry. This forms your mindset. If you believe something's pagan and idolatry, there's a view, a world view that comes with that. And the people that are contrary to that, there's a way that you think about them. Okay? Like, they're following idolatry, bro. This is Antichrist. They're following the way of the devil. So as you can see, it doesn't matter what Hippolytus said in the late 2nd century, 3rd century. There's another church father that opposed him and would call that man straying away from the truth. Okay? That's the point. So this pro-Christmas person is saying that Christians didn't make a deal about birthdays. Now, if you for example, if I was to go online right now, let's see here. And I typed this in earlier just so I can have for y'all for this class. Would Jesus' apostles celebrate his birthday? Because these apostles just run around talking about, we're not celebrating the birth, we're celebrating the incarnation. And the Bible doesn't speak against it. There's nothing wrong with it. Fine, and if nothing wrong with it, if the apostles of Jesus Christ was living with us, would they participate with you? Since they think there's nothing wrong with it, they would have to say, yes, they would. Because why would the apostles oppose something that's not bad and it's honoring Christ? So would the apostles of Jesus, with Peter, Paul, John, Mark, Luke, well, I don't think Luke was, Mattathias, the other John, would these men, would they themselves, if they were with us today, being the foundation layers of the faith, would they themselves participate in the celebration of the incarnational birthday of Jesus? Would they do it? Because that would tell us a lot about what's happening right now. See, if I say, hey, would the apostles participate in the communion today? Yes. Would the apostles join Christians in going to the Super Bowl? No. Therefore, that tells you a lot about the people who do go to the Super Bowls. Would the apostles and them, would they encourage vaping and smoking? No. They would view that as immoral and damaging to the vessel of God. Therefore, that tell you a lot about the ministers who make excuses for vaping and smoking today. So when it comes to Christmas, would the Lord's own apostles participate? So we have to know what their mindset was like to contrast it to the mindset people got today, so that we can then know what would they have done. Because however they thought, that would influence their decisions. All right. So if you look up, would Jesus' apostles celebrate his birthday? All right. This is what AI said, but AI is not a real person. It's a database pulling from different sources in the world and kind of summarizing things. And it's taking the consensus of things, and then they'll take some different sources if they're varying opinions, and they would just list it out for you. Okay. Now, but you don't use AI to have discernment to determine what is right and what is wrong. It's a database. You use it just like a regular library. Okay. Now, would Jesus' apostles celebrate his birthday? So this one says, no, Jesus' apostles did not celebrate his birthday. Right? Y'all can find that easily in your Bibles. Right? The Bible doesn't mention them doing so. That's why people ask these questions. And early Christians, meaning the apostles' time and the first 3 centuries that other letter was talking about, that other article I was reading, generally avoided birthday celebrations. Avoided is important. That word right there is important. Okay. because it wasn't as if celebrating births and having parties for them wasn't a thing. And so, you know, they lived and died in their generation. They didn't even know what a birthday was. So later generations come up with this idea of birthdays. And so it's just this new thing in the world. And so we can't use that to say what the apostles had celebrated it because, or done it, because it wasn't even a thing for them to consider during their lifetime. Okay? So somebody would be like, well, Christmas, you could say the same thing about Christmas. No, because Christmas is celebrating the incarnation or birth of Christ, and they had a viewpoint about the incarnation and birth. So therefore, we can actually compare and say, would the apostles of Jesus Christ participate in this new developed thing called Christmas that's based upon something that violated their consciences during their lifetime? Okay? So no, Jesus' apostles did not celebrate his birthday. The Bible doesn't mention them doing so. And early Christians generally avoided birthday celebrations. Why? Viewing them as pagan customs. Now, when we're talking about pagan, let me put this over here. Pagan definition. So y'all can know, okay? We're using the word pagan. Got a couple of uses here. A person holding religious beliefs other than those of the main or recognized religions, or in this case, contrary to the gospel that the apostles handed down. Anybody believe in something contrary. So for example, somebody may say Jesus is the Christ, but if their Jesus is not God manifest in flesh, or their Jesus didn't come in human form, they think he's a hologram, their idea, their doctrine is a pagan idea. It's heathenistic. It didn't come from God, it came from demons. So demonic doctrine is pagan doctrine. All right. So when we talk about something pagan in origin, we're not talking about just some idea somebody borrowed from some pre-existing thing that the heathens were doing. We're talking about something that came from demons. The things that the vain traditions the heathens were practicing came from demons. But even if a Christian in a church made it up, like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, that's still pagan because that whole idea came from demons, not from God. Santa Claus came from demons. It doesn't matter if a artist in the modern century made up the fat man with the beard. It doesn't matter. It came from demons. So I need to understand, pagan doesn't mean that you borrowed from some pre-existing idolatrous festival. Okay, pagan just means something that is not orthodox to the faith, that its origins comes from demons. That's what we're talking about here. All right. Let's see here. He said, let me holler at you right quick. And it's been almost 2 hours. A good point is a quick point. There's no need to ramble for so long. Well, the point had already been made. What I'm doing right now, I'm expounding on it, going into details to prove the point. If you don't got patience, son of God, 3000, you could hit that backspace button or back arrow and back on up out of here. And if that's the case, every apologist videos will be shorts. Okay, will be shorts. Nobody would have an hour-long stream to make a point or a teaching. Everything will be shorts. All right, if you're gonna be consistent with your words right there. All right, a good point is a quick point. Or then everything should be shorts. Get to the point, Jesus. This Sermon on the Mount is taking too long. You're rambling. All right. But anyway, I want y'all to see what pagan means. Okay. Holding or constituting religious beliefs other than those of the main or recognized religions, heathen, ungodly, irreligious. So another way of referring to pagan would mean ungodliness. That's why when it comes to conduct and how Christians live their lives, the pagan says, the apostle said, don't live as the heathens live. How does the heathens live? Right? When they're in violence and murder and sexual sins and idolatries and stuff. That's living like a heathen. So that the way of conduct is heathen or pagan in origin. So please understand, brothers and sisters, y'all growing your understanding what pagan means or something being pagan in origin. It doesn't mean you had to adopt or some pre-existing festival or thing for it to be pagan in origin. Its origins must come from demons and a way of life be contrary to God for it to be considered the manner of the heathens or paganistic way or Hellenistic way of living. Okay? So understand that. All right. Now, Let's go back to that article that's proving the point of what the apostle said when he said, hold a firm grip to that which we handed down to you, whether it be orally or by letter. Now we get an insight to what they said, orally or by letter, and the mindset of the believers who followed what the apostles were teaching, to contrast that to the things we're dealing with today. All right, to see who's holding a strong grip or who's making excuses. So far, this by the way, for anybody that's coming in, this article is by a person who actually does celebrate Christmas, see no problem with it. They're just going through the historical things to show how we got to it. Okay, and so the question is why do we celebrate his birthday at all? And he says the early church didn't. They love Jesus more. You know what I mean? What we saying? We love Jesus more than they did. They didn't believe in Christ's deity because they didn't make a feast for his birth. Like, that's stupid, bro. So when I go to that comment that the Jesus Saved brother made under that brother Dre's video, talking about the people that are anti-Christmas really because they don't accept the deity of Jesus. For the first 300 years of the church, my brothers, people who taught that Jesus Christ was divine also didn't make no feast to celebrate it. So what are we to make of them? They didn't really believe it's divine because they didn't make a big deal about that day. Like, stop it, bro. Stop it. So he then says that the first 3 centuries of the church didn't even celebrate birthdays. And then it says Origen of Alexandria, which was the most influential theologian in Alexandria at the time, all right, around the same time as Hippolytus is around, said that only sinners celebrate births. Godless men like Pharaoh and Herod celebrate their birthdays. So that means in his mind and in the mind of other believers who avoided birthdays, as this pro-Christmas person has eloquently admitted to, okay, that lets us know the mindset of the believers of that time. So now, if I was to say, hey, today, I'm not literally today's not my birthday for real, but next month on January 16th, 2026, Lord's will, I'll turn 38 years old. If I wanted to throw myself a party and a feast and invite everybody, if I was to send that invitation to Apostle Paul or to an Origen or to a Tertullian or to a Peter or somebody like that, if I was to invite them and say, hey, it's my birthday, it's my birthday party, you celebrate the day I was born and came into this world, okay? Would they come to the party is the question, all right? The answer is they would not come to the party. They wouldn't come to the party. They will actually rebuke me because their mindset is, you do not make a big deal about your birthday and then make a festival and party surrounding this. That is a pagan idea. Only sinners, godless men think like that and act like that. They would actually tell me not to do it. Okay? All right, word room. Thank you for the comment there. See, I may have missed it, but I don't see how, celebrating the incarnation of God has origins from demons. And that's what we're dealing with right now. What we're doing right now is, what we're establishing is the doctrine and mindset that the apostles of Jesus Christ taught the believers during their time to answer the question, the historical, accurate, factual, evidential, whatever words we want to throw in there, so that we will know the reason why these historians all agree that from the time of Jesus Christ through the first couple of centuries of the Christian church, they avoided celebrating birthdays. Okay? Incarnation is talking about Jesus Christ coming into the flesh so he could be born. That's what that's about. But they avoided those whole ideas because they viewed it as from idolatrous, superstitious practices of the heathens. It was a pagan custom. That's what this is saying. That's what Origen said. That's what Josephus said. He said the law does not permit us to make festivals of our children's births or make a big deal about it, but to train them up in the way of the law of the Lord so that they may not let go of it. Okay? So this is the mindset of these people. So when a person would come later on and say, oh, we're going to start celebrating the births, these same apostles who laid the foundation of the church, they would oppose that idea. And we know they would oppose it because we know what they taught and we know their mindset regarding the topic. So we know they would actually avoid it, just as the other Christians who followed them did. So now we got to deal with the fact that, hey, if the foundation layers of the faith viewed this at a certain way, and their mindset was to avoid the practice. All these historians account for it. We still got letters of people arguing against the idea of trying to calculate Jesus Christ's birth and make a whole little festival. We got these evidences of these things where they're saying sinners alone act like this. Okay? Then we have to take into account the fact that the apostles would actually have rejected this idea as being pagan or antichrist. All right? Now, it's not a difference. There is no difference. We're about to get into that. We're about to get into that. All right? They're intertwined to celebrate. Let me keep going. That's what you modern day brothers and sisters are saying. All right? Y'all are saying there's a difference between celebrating a birthday and celebrating an incarnation. Okay? There is no difference. There literally is no difference. Okay? Now, to make a deal about any day of Christ's birth, for example, Christ's birth, or to make a big deal about incarnation, now you got a festival, and now you got all these traditions that you've syncretized in order to make it easy for your converts and all kind of stuff. You gotta. Let me just read. All right. Let me see here. Well, if you are a Christian between 1st and 3rd century, you may avoid to put up a big Christmas party. Otherwise, you may end up on a Roman cross or some random Roman circus. Hey, you know what? Oh, man. That's actually funny. That just made me laugh. The crazy part is that, like, when you look into things like Celtinia, I know that people argue that it didn't take place on the 25th. It was through the 17th through the 23rd or whatever. None of that really matters. The point is that when Celtinia came around, which literally looked just like Christmas, the Christians were easily to pick out as being Christians because they were the people in the empire that didn't participate in those societal norm things that was rooted in paganism. And so when they would see homes not decorated with lights or some wreath on the door or something that was one of the symbols of Saturninian things, whereas the rest of the empire was participating, even people that wasn't part of the Saturn worship, because you had Saturn, you had other gods Romans worship within the empire. But it was a polytheistic thing. So people that weren't part of the mainstream Saturn worship, Saturnalia was one of those main things. So when that feast took over and it was in the streets and stuff, people that weren't part of it joined it. So now when you're dealing with Christians during that time, the fact that they refused to have any association with it, they wouldn't decorate at all. So they wouldn't have no lights, no wreaths, no nothing. And so they stood out like a sore thumb. Now, the ones who didn't want to be persecuted started to decorate just so that they can avoid persecution. Just like when you read the church history, there were times where, for example, Christians, when they were under persecution, there was safety in practicing Judaism, but it was danger for being a Christian. So some of the Christians would not publicly publicize their faith in Jesus, and they would act as if they're part of Judaism to avoid persecution. All right. And yes, Christians were thrown in Roman circus because that was one of the things they actually avoided. They avoided the Roman circuses. And if anybody don't know what the Roman circus is, that's where your chariot horses, you had the Circus Maximus outside of the Roman Colosseum. You had the gladiatorial games inside the Colosseum. And outside of that, across the street, was the Circus Maximus, which was an outdoor arena where they did like chariot races and stuff. You had the Arch of Titus there, gloating about what he did to the Jews in 70 AD. But they had the Circus Maximus. Matter of fact, the Roman Colosseum, when you look into the history of how it got built, they actually used the riches and the monies that they got when they ransacked the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD to build it. The Roman Colosseum is an actual idols temple that was dedicated to false gods. They used the gold and monies that Titus and them got when they ransacked Jerusalem in 70 AD to build it. That's why across the street in the Circus Maximus, they have the Arch of Titus, and on it, he's gloating about what he did to the Jews. Okay? So all of that Roman Colosseum stuff, where you get your modern day arenas and stadiums built upon that design, all this is connected back to heathenism, idolatry, and what the people did there to Jerusalem. Okay? All this got to do with that. Okay? Now, to what the brother is saying, yes, the Christians that were persecuted one of the things that the Romans would do is throw him into the midst of the Circus Max, into the Roman Colosseum, where the gladiators would fight and stuff, and they would have the lions and stuff come out. And if the Christian feared this life or feared losing this life enough, they would get up and try to fight the beast, which would then is what the people wanted. They wanted to see a fight between the human and the animal. And so the Christians that were afraid to die would then try to preserve their lives by fighting the animals, which would then be to the entertainment of the people in the stands. But the Christians who did not fear losing this life for the sake of Christ, this is where you get that famous picture where you have the Christians on their knees and the one guy standing in the middle like this, and they're praying while the lions are walking around them. That's an image to show how they didn't fear losing their lives for the sake of Christ, and they would rather have died by being mauled by lions than to appease the senses of those idolaters and murderers in the stands who just wanted to see fighting and gore between man and beast for entertainment, as they did these things in honor of their false gods. Okay? So they would cast the Christians who didn't participate in these things into the Colosseums, and they'd be mauled to death and things like that. So yeah, if you didn't participate in these different things at that time, you were liable to be persecuted for it. Okay? But because we live in America and things like that, you know, think about the brothers and sisters who are in parts of Nigeria right now. If they were to go, we're celebrating Christmas, and they walk around, it's Jesus' birthday, or we celebrate the incarnation, and blah, blah, guess what's going to happen? The militia is going to be like, that's where he at. Boom, get him. Okay? Because they're just looking for whoever calls those Christians. Okay? And they're ready to annihilate them. So this is what it would have been like in Rome. Now, unlike other things like communion or just calling yourself Christian, what we're establishing right now is that the apostles and them had a viewpoint and ideology regarding birthdays. And for years, even though they believed Christ was God manifest in the flesh and all these other things you read in the Bible, they avoided making a feast or a big deal about what people are calling right now the incarnation. The apostles, though they know he was incarnate, John said it. But John and the other apostles who knew Christ was incarnate, they make a big deal about the day or the timing of the incarnation. Okay? They just said he was incarnate and left it alone. Okay? But they didn't make a big deal and start guesstimating, oh, he was incarnate around this time and this time and this time. And then we started to celebrate a feast to celebrate the incarnation. They didn't do it. They didn't do that stuff that people are doing now. So though they knew he was incarnate, they still avoided establishing a festival in honor of the incarnation. This is important. Why? Ain't no problem with that. Why didn't you do that? Then Jesus Christ was born. I mean, what's wrong with celebrating Christ is born? Okay? What's wrong with that? And even though they knew he was born, they didn't tell you what day he was born. They didn't give you any other details. That's why you got to fetch through, trying to find a needle haystack to try to come up with these guesstimations of time. But what I'm going to show you right quick in this article is why. The question is look, if the apostles were avoiding this, they didn't establish it, even though they believe he was incarnate, even though they believe he was God man in the flesh, even though they know he was born, they testified he came in human flesh. Why didn't they establish some festival? Why didn't they make a big deal about it the way people today are making a big deal about it? Why didn't they say things like, we're celebrating the day he incarnated, or what's wrong with celebrating his birth? Why is it that the things people are saying today, the apostles and them didn't say then, and they literally avoided it? So the question that we hear today, what's wrong with celebrating Christ's birth? The answer would lie in the mindset and ideas of the apostles who literally avoided it because it was pagan. It came from heathens. So if somebody says, they say, well, I don't see nothing wrong with, that's fine. You don't see, that's actually a problem you don't see, because the people who laid down the faith that you're holding to, they saw something wrong with it. Everybody want to keep saying, I don't see nothing wrong with it. The apostles saw something wrong with it. All historians have told you they saw something wrong with it. So Origen told you he saw something wrong with it. Tertullian saw something wrong with it. Who else? You got plenty of people keep seeing something wrong with it. And they're all accounting that the apostles saw something wrong with it, and the idea of celebrating births. But now people today are like, what's wrong with celebrating the birth of Jesus? So that's showing people are not holding tight grip like they should. So what we're seeing is that the apostles, we got to start with the foundation of stuff. You can't start at where Christmas trees come from. You can't start at what's wrong. I don't see nothing wrong with celebrating Christ's birth. It's Christ's birth. I don't see nothing wrong with celebrating the incarnation. We're just celebrating the fact that he incarnate. God became flesh. Like, that's what y'all saying. But we need to start with the foundation people. The foundation people taught us he was incarnate. But the foundation people did not make a deal about his incarnation to make it a festival. We need to say, why? Why not? It's not enough that they didn't do it. They could have not done it for many reasons. But why didn't they? They knew he was born. They told us he was born. They knew how old he was. They knew he went to the temple at 8 days old. They knew he began his ministry about 30 years old. They knew how old he was. But why didn't they make a festival to honor his birth? Why? Then, when we have pro-Christmas people, anti-Christmas people, historians, whether it be secular or religious, and they all testify that the apostles and the first couple of centuries of the church avoided celebrating birthdays because they viewed it, meaning they believed their worldview was that it was pagan to do so. Then you got people like Oregon, for example, the 3rd century, saying only sinners make a deal of the day of the births, like Pharaoh and Herod. Not God, not saints. Only sinners do that. So when you got this amount of evidence about the mindset of these people, which then answers the reason why you don't see Christmas or anything like that in your Bibles, we know why. Now that we know why, now when we get into this change of mindset, now we can see who's letting things go. So now when this article begins to get into how we got to the Christmas. Now, it says this, because remember, he ended with saying the thinking of the church from the time of the apostles to the first couple centuries of the church, they avoided celebrating birthdays because they saw it as pagan. Now he says it started with the Gnostic who had an epiphany. Now he's about to say how Christmas became a thing, how the celebrating of the incarnation became a thing. Now he's about to explain this to us, all right? Now, let's read this so y'all can see. Let me move this off the screen. All right. It started with the Gnostic who had an epiphany. The churches began to change their thinking on this. On what? What he just finished talking about. They started changing their thinking about it being pagan to celebrate births and things like that. They started to change their thinking on this, not because of cultural pressure, meaning the heathens wasn't coming to the church and be like, y'all don't celebrate birthdays? Y'all God must be not real because he don't got no birthday. Like, it wasn't from outside pressures, but because of a theological argument, controversy related to a titanic struggle for the identity of Christianity. Throughout the 2nd and 3rd centuries, meaning during the time of Hippolytus and Origen, throughout the 2nd and 3rd centuries, the church was in jeopardy of being co-opted by an alien worldview known as Gnosticism. Excuse me. These were the Gnostic heretics that some historians, biblical scholars, and novelists in our own day are incomprehensibly enamored of. Like the New Age movement of our own day, Gnosticism owned almost many variations as there were teachers. And there were thousands. This was a big thing. This wasn't a small thing. But at the core of it, there was one central theme. Matter is evil, meaning like physical things like a table. They believe that tables were evil, right? Intrinsically evil, inherently evil. They believe matter was evil and God has absolutely nothing to do with the material world. So because of their idea that matter was evil, the idea that God would incarnate in flesh was cast out. All right? This is what we're talking about when we talk about Gnosticism, okay? Because matter is evil, the very idea that God would incarnate in flesh, they threw out. That tight grip that apostles talked about, hold tight to what we held on, what we passed down to you, whether it be orally or letter, they still was believing, still having some kind of profession of Jesus being the Messiah and all that. They still believe there was a God. Okay, so they didn't become atheists, but instead, because of the doctrine that matter was evil, something seemingly non-essential, but that matter was evil, therefore, the seemingly non-essential idea that matter was evil caused them to let go what people would call the essentials of the faith. Which in this case, since matter is evil, God could not have incarnate in flesh, because then that would make God evil. Okay? So they threw it out. Now, significantly, the Gnostics did not care whether the gospel story was historical fact. All right? where the gospel story talks about Christ literally incarnate in flesh, like an actual human person, which would mean his body was made out of matter. But in their mind, matter is evil. So if they was to hold on and believe that Christ actually incarnate in literal human flesh through a birth, through birth in Virgin Mary, that would then make Christ evil, okay, by nature. So they stopped holding on to Christ being incarnate, okay. So it says, so it says, significantly, the Gnostics did not care whether the gospel story was historical fact. They were not interested in facts, only constructed a new Christ myth or another Jesus, okay. Against this idea, the early church fathers, the most influential pastors, thinkers, and leaders of the early churches, held fast to an uncompromising doctrine that Jesus Christ, the Son of God from heaven, was born in this world as a man, that he was real flesh and blood human being who lived, died, and rose again in human history. That's the truth. But, here we go. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke each carry stories about the birth of Jesus, and a major theme of the Gospel of John is that Jesus is the light that has come into the world from heaven. As John also says, the word Christ became flesh and dwelt among us. The theological term for this doctrine is incarnation. The theological term for this doctrine is the incarnation, where the divine spirit comes into human flesh, take on a human form. Incarnation, okay? This means John taught incarnation, but he did not celebrate a feast of incarnation. The apostles taught that Christ incarnated, or the doctrine of incarnation, or the theological term incarnation. They taught it, but they didn't make a big deal of it to make it a festival, having a party and adopting customs and having lights and giving gifts. And they didn't do any of that. They just taught the doctrine. Okay? They just taught the doctrine. So incarnation is not a new thing. It's something that was laid down by the foundation layers of the faith, but the way that people are doing incarnation or the celebration of it today, they're not sharing the same mindset and attitude that the foundation layers had in regards to the doctrine that they taught. See? Meaning they taught incarnation, but they didn't make a big deal about this. They ain't worried about establishing no feast. All the churches in unity, believing incarnation for centuries, with no festival to celebrate it. They just had the teaching or the doctrine. But because of the Gnostics, who believed matter was evil, and therefore Christ couldn't have incarnated, some of the church fathers, okay, because there was no council, there was no ecumenical thing that was like, today we shall establish the feast of the incarnation. Instead, it was some church fathers over in the corner somewhere who started to try to come up with responses to the Gnostic issue, okay? And now they began to overemphasize, instead of just restating what the doctrine is, the proof, they went beyond that and blew it up further than what the apostles ever would have thought of. And so the theological doctrine is the incarnation. As the doctrine of incarnation began to increase in importance, incarnation when they say increase importance, meaning as the doctrine or the belief of the divine eternal God taking on human form grew in importance. It was something that the church believed. It was an important event, but it was not something that was of great significance that they gave great focus to it. It was something that they knew and believed, but it was okay, but they focused on his death. That's why they had communion established, okay? But because of this Gnosticism, some of these church fathers began to go beyond what the apostles ever in the church would have ever thought regarding the incarnation. So because of when the doctrine of incarnation began to increase in importance, especially in the Eastern churches, the question began to be debated exactly when was it that God entered the world in Jesus Christ? Was it functionally at his baptism, as the Gnostics taught, or in actuality at his birth? Now, to scriptures, the writers we got from the apostles, Ellis was at his birth. But because these false teachers were saying, no, it was at his baptism, when the Holy Spirit descended upon him, that's when it happened. So they're trying to disconnect Christ from being fully human and born as a human. And so they try to disconnect that and then say the incarnation took place at the moment of his baptism. That's what they were doing, all right? So it says, so apparently, the first person to lead a celebration of God's entrance to the world in Christ or incarnation, according to Clement of Alexandria, was a 2nd century Gnostic heretic in Alexandria named Basilides. So the idea of a festival celebrating the incarnation, okay, didn't even start with people who actually believed the truth of Christ. It started with a heretic. Okay? It started with a heretic. And so it started with a heretic who didn't believe Jesus Christ is born truly fully man and that his incarnation took place at the baptism. So they established a feast to celebrate that. So now at that time in history, this is what the church looked like. This is what the atmosphere of the Christian church looked like. You had all the churches that believed Christ was born as fully man, fully God, believed in the incarnation, but nobody had some festival. They didn't concern themselves with it. The Gnostics, who was saying Christ wasn't fully man and that God couldn't, that matter was evil and stuff, they had a feast. So the Gnostics had a feast celebrating the incarnation, which wasn't about his birth, through the Virgin Mary, but about the baptism, when the Holy Spirit came down and sent upon him. That was the feast of incarnation at this time. Okay? Now, so according to let me get back to it. Let me get my spot. Where is it? Oh, give me a second. I lost my spot. Here we go. Apparently, the first person to lead a celebration of God's entrance into the world, or incarnation, through Christ, according to Clement of Alexandria, was a 2nd century Gnostic heretic in Alexandria named Basilides. So according to Clement of Alexandria, the first person to lead a celebration or feast or party about an incarnation did not come from Clement, didn't come from any church father that believed Christ was fully human and fully God. It came from a heretic that believed the incarnation happened at baptism. He preached that Christ, the Word, the divine nature, came upon the human Jesus at his baptism and thus appeared on earth at this time. Basilides and his followers therefore celebrated Epiphany, from the Greek word epiphania, appearing on January 6th, the date of Jesus' baptism. This is the origin of celebrating the incarnation. That's the origin of that. Okay? That is the origin. It came from pagans, heathens, idolaters who didn't even believe Christ was fully man. That's where it came from. Okay? Now, you may wonder how they came up with the date. So he goes about that, right? And then, so you can look into how they came up with the date, their little calculations, okay? But let's get to the point of the church fathers' response to the heretics who already had a feast of Epiphany, but it was all based upon lies and demon doctrines. So the origin of a festival celebrating Epiphany began with the doctrine of demons. I need y'all to understand that. It began with the doctrine of demons. Now, before Christmas, there was Epiphany. Now, by the way, for those just coming in, this article is written by a person that is pro-Christmas. They don't see nothing wrong with it. They don't see nothing wrong with that, okay? He's just going through the historical lead up to how y'all got December 25th worldwide, okay? Before Christmas, there was Epiphany. But he's saying the first person, according to Clement Alexandria, to have a celebration around the incarnation was heretics who was following the doctrine of demons who believed that the incarnation took place at the time of Christ's baptism. Okay? Other churches throughout the East more or less copied the Alexandrian model. The Alexandrian church eventually brought in virtually every story in which it could be said that the divine Christ appeared in addition to his baptism. For them, Epiphany also commemorates the wedding of Cana, where the water was turned to wine, the feeding of the multitudes and others. One episode, however, seemed especially to reverberate among the churches and continue to be associated with Epiphany over the generations, the appearing of the star and the visit of the Magi. Whether all or any of the events actually occurred historically on January 5th or 6th was never the point. The point was to celebrate Christ's appearing, or incarnation. By the early 4th century, the theological arguments had shifted. And most significant discussion was the nature of Christ's divinity. Not surprisingly, the birth of Jesus was now just as important in the Feast of Epiphany as the baptism of Jesus was. The night of January 5th, Epiphany Eve, had become the festival of Jesus' birth. And January 6th, Epiphany proper, commemorated his baptism by John. So at this point, there's still no Christmas. There's still no December 25th at this point, okay? So it's walking through the historical lead up to it, showing that the idea of celebrating the incarnation began with heretics. It didn't begin with Orthodox people. It began with heretics, the Gnostics, who followed the doctrine of demons, all right? We may fairly say then, now this is the author of the article saying this, we may fairly say then that Christmas was originally observed on January 6th, or more precisely, Christmas Eve was originally on the night of January 5th to the 6th, okay? Because at this point in history, though there was no Christmas in December 25th going on, because of the emphasis, the growing emphasis of the incarnation and the birth, proving Christ's divinity and his, his origin stuff, they started to focus more heavily on this aspect of Christ's life, even though the apostles didn't. They started to emphasize on it. And the heretic Gnostics already had a festival going on called the Epiphany. And it was based upon their doctrine of demons about the incarnation that happened at the time of Christ's baptism. And no other churches had any other there was no other Epiphany feast. There was no Christmas feast over here. It was just the Gnostics having a celebration about the incarnation, but it was based on doctrines of demons. So the church fathers' response to that was not just reiterate the truth of the gospel, X out these heretics and stuff. Instead, they adopt the feast and then emphasize the trueness of doctrine in it. Okay? That's what they did. Adopted the feast, the celebration. So their minds, as this article said, the minds started to shift from the apostles and the early church avoiding celebrating birthdays and stuff because it's connected to paganism. Origin in the 3rd century, only sinners celebrate or make big deals of their births, like Pharaoh and Herod, not saints. But then later on, as the Gnostics thing grew and they had their little Epiphany feast going on based on their doctrine of demons, some of the church fathers' response to that was adopt this feast, but emphasize the trueness or make a focus about the doctrine of how Christ was born and how the incarnation really happened. That's what happened. There still was no Christ Mass or December 25th. This was just the January 5th, 6th time frame thing going on, okay? Let's see here. Epiphany, church had liturgies in which there were scripture readings of the nativity stories from Matthew and Luke, interspersed with hymns and choir anthems and alleluias. It would all be familiar to us. Epiphany seemed to hold a special significance for the Palestine churches, and they observed it with much splendor and fervency. Particularly emphasis was placed on the theme, Christ the light that has come into the world. On the night of January 5th to 6th, multitudes of Christians would gather in Bethlehem at the cave where they supposed Jesus was born, have an all-night worship service with much singing. See, because Epiphany feasts, even though people really celebrating the birth of Jesus, we're celebrating the incarnation. The incarnation had nothing to do with a manger. It had nothing to do with a cave. It had nothing to do with wise men and magi's and shepherds visiting them, the little boy. The incarnation has absolutely nothing to do with the event surrounding Christ's birth. Incarnation has to do with a private matter that happened when the Holy Spirit overcame Mary and impregnated her. See? Incarnation has to do with the moment that the divine spirit took on human form. In Mary's womb, out of the sight of all human beings, and nobody knows the moment that it happened. Okay? That's what Epiphany was supposed to be about, but you see, well, its beginnings, the doctrine of incarnation is about that. The Feast of Epiphany, its origins with the Gnostics, who rejected how Christ was born because they believed matter was evil. So they had a feast called Epiphany that was based and rooted in their doctrines of demons. And the other churches had nothing to do with it. But as the problem began to increase, church fathers in different churches, especially in the East, adopted the Epiphany feast idea, okay? Adopted the feast idea, but to emphasize the trueness of the doctrine. And since they made such a big point emphasizing Christ's birth and how it happened, now you have this Feast of Epiphany where when it takes place, they're going to a cave where they think he was born at. What's that got to do with incarnation? So you see how incarnation and birthday is intertwined. It's together. Okay? It's together. Not in reality, but that's what people have made it. They've made it together. Okay? So now when you talk about celebrating the incarnation, you celebrate at the same time on a date you think he was born, December 25th. Incarnation got nothing to do with December 25th. December 25th got to do with the supposed time frame he was actually born. That's why there's the manger scene. That's why there's the Magi's, even though they didn't come to him when he was born. That's why there's the shepherd story that's spoken about on Christmas, because it has to do with the day he was born. So you are celebrating his birth. But these apologists with their slick tongues, all right, and seemingly highly intellectual minds, they say, we ain't celebrating the birth. We're celebrating the incarnation on the day you believe he was born. All your carols is based upon the Savior is born. Oh, yes, Christ, the Savior is born. You're celebrating he's born. Birthday. So to lie to the people and say, we're not celebrating his birth, we're not making a deal about his birth, we're celebrating the incarnation, you're lying and deceiving them. You're talking about celebrating an incarnation that took privately, that would happen privately, doing it on a day you believe he was born. All your carols is based around him being born. Christmas, the birth of Christ. That's literally what the word means. Version. Nothing I love more than people arguing about which version of Batman is the real Batman. You know what? And it's required, all right? Even though we ain't really arguing about Batman. Batman is heathens and pagan ideas. But nevertheless, yes, among the Church of Christ, there's a necessity to defend the realness of Jesus against the falsehoods of Jesus, all right? So, yes. So, hey, stay put, Mike. So, now, go back to this article. As you see in the lead up to December 25th, so far, we got an Epiphany feast now that's now been adopted by some of the churches, not all the churches, some of the churches. All right, this wasn't a worldwide Christian thing. There were still churches avoiding the whole idea of celebrating incarnation and the feast and stuff. You had some churches in the East, had Gnosticism being a great influence. You had some church fathers that adopted the idea, and some churches started to establish their own version of Epiphany to emphasize the trueness of Christ's incarnation, which has nothing to do with when he was born, but nevertheless the two become intertwined because they start to focus on something the apostles and them never gave great significance to, which was the day of birth. Okay? Now, well, perhaps it is too much to call all of this a Christmas observance because it was much more than a celebration of the nativity. This is what the pro-Christmas person is saying. Okay? For example, Professor Coleman describes a liturgy contained in the Egyptian papyrus from the early 4th century that celebrates the birth, not the incarnation, the birth of Christ on January 5th, 6th. Bible readings included narratives from Matthew and Luke concerning the nativity, meaning the birth. Nativity is birth. Incarnation is when he became flesh. But when he became flesh has nothing to do with when he was born. There were two separate events. Okay? But we see, as a response to the Gnostics, some of these church fathers adopted the Feast of Epiphany and gave it their own spin to then emphasize the trueness of the doctrines of Christ. But now they're hyper-focusing on something the apostles never did. And now their mindset's got to shift from avoiding emphasizing days of births to now emphasizing days of births. See, now you're seeing where the mindset shifts. So whereas the apostles avoided emphasizing this because they believe it was a pagan custom and idea to do so, while Origen avoided it because it was idolatry and sinners alone made a deal about birthdays. Now, in response to the Gnostic heresies, some church fathers shifted their mindsets away from what the apostles established to now they began to emphasize the day of birth. And so now you got their own version of Epiphany now. Okay? It still ain't December 25th Christmas, but they're celebrating the birth of Christ. They're emphasizing the birth. But it was in January, though. All right? And they're reading the narratives of Christ's birth from Matthew and the Gospel of Luke, but in January, not in December. All right. And let's give you some examples of it. Now, sometime between 325 and 355. Matter of fact, he asked a question right before he goes into it. The main point is that by the 4th century, the elements of what we call Christmas were already in place. This is why some of those apologists, when they're arguing against people who are saying that Christmas borrowed from pagan ideas and things like that, and they say, no, it's not pagan in origin, it's Christian in origin. And when people reference Constantine and stuff to say that's the origin of Christmas, this is why they read to you guys things from like late 2nd century, early 3rd century to say, no, people are already celebrating Christ's birth. Even though we ain't celebrating Christ's birth, we're celebrating the incarnation. They're already celebrating Christ's birth in January. That is historically accurate, that people were celebrating Christ's birth prior to Constantine. They were celebrating his birth through festivals and making a big deal about his birth before the December 25th official worldwide date that we see today. That is historically accurate. But what the problem is, is that in order to even get to Christmas, it had to start with what happened that started with the January Epiphany Feast. And the only reason that happened is because there were some church fathers that shifted their mindsets in regards to the view about births, making a deal about birthdays, because they were dealing with the Gnostic heresies. So they adopted the Epiphany Feast, had their own little spin on it, and then they started to emphasize what the apostles never made a big deal about. And now you have this thing in January. So then the question is that he asked, well, how then did we back up from January 6th to December 25th? Remember, for anybody coming in, this article is by a pro-Christmas person. He's just going through history stuff. How then did we back from January 6th, to December 25th? And how do we go from celebrating his coming into the world, incarnation, in a general sense, to celebrating specifically his birthday? How do we go to that? Now, you see how it's a chain of reaction? It's not like somebody woke up overnight and there's Christmas. It starts off with this one thing and then it just grows into this other thing. Okay? That's what's happening here. Now, sometime between 325 and 355, probably beginning in Rome, the birth of Christ began to be seen as a distinct event to be celebrated in its own right. So instead of it being merged together with the incarnation or the Epiphany feast, right? Instead of it being one thing in January, they want to separate it, make it its own thing. So leave the January thing for the Epiphany, their new version of the Epiphany, but make the birth a whole separate thing, okay? There were several reasons for this development, why they wanted to do that. The most significant factor was theology. The Arian controversy. So you see how where all this is coming from? So, excuse me. The whole reason why you even had an Epiphany celebrating the incarnation is because it started off with Gnostic heretics who had that kind of festival, but they had doctrines of demons associated with it. And so the church response, even though they didn't have a feast at that time they weren't making a big deal about births or incarnations. But because of the Gnostic folks and their great influence, the church then shifted their focus away from where it was to now adopt this new way to try to deal with heretics. So they adopt the Epiphany feast, change the reason for it, and then, now they got the January 5th, 6th thing. They're focused on birthdays now. But then later on, another controversy arises, the Arian controversy. The Arian controversy that raised in the early 4th century led to the new developments of the doctrine of the person of Christ. The Council of Nicaea convened in 325 primarily to deal with the issue raised by Arianism, specifically condemned the teaching which denied that God became incarnate in Jesus at his birth. So you have the incarnation that has to do with God taking on human form. The Gnostics believe matter was evil, so they believe that basically the Holy Spirit just like kind of incarnate, or the Epiphany, in Jesus at the moment of baptism. Not that he really took on human form, but more like Christ was just a body that, I don't even know how to necessarily word this the right way that would help y'all right now. May the Lord, give me the right words to say going forward. But as we read here, the Gnostics believe matter was evil. All right. So they believe the Epiphany, or the divine one coming down, was at the moment of baptism. They didn't believe he was born a human, because that would mean he was born evil to them, because they thought matter was evil and bodies made out of matter. So, but then the Arians controversy came up, and you see that closeness of time period that's going on. The Gnostics thing was in the 3rd century. The Arian thing was in the 4th century. So it ain't even that long time. Okay. But anyway, so now this is focused, because the Arian controversy about the birth, how it happened. Like, so now it's this great focus on that. All right. Julius, the Bishop of Rome, played a particularly active role in these deliberations and is said to be instrumental in separating the nativity from the Epiphany. So this is how you got where we got now, where you have in January people celebrate the Epiphany, while in December people are celebrating the nativity. This is why you got to separate it now. But back before, this was all one event, one feast, where they were celebrating both things, the incarnation and the birth. Okay? But because of ontological debates, they decided to separate it and make them two separate things now. And that's why they're two separate things today in our time. So it says, this time, the challenge was not from the Gnostics, who believed that Jesus became divine at his baptism. Now it was from the Arians, who taught that the Son of God was less than God, but more than a man. Up to this time, all the celebration of Jesus' birth in Epiphany was joined with and even eclipsed by commemoration mainly of his baptism. So that's what was going on. So remember, the origins of this Holy Epiphany feast came from heretics. The church adopted it to try to rename it. But when they did that, there were still struggles and problems theologically in this new tradition they've made up. Okay. And so they're battling this. And so now when the Arian controversy arises, they're like, we need to separate the Feast of Epiphany from the Feast of the Nativity. Instead of it being one thing, we need to make them two separate things so that one can emphasize one thing and the other one can emphasize another thing. All right, that's why they did it. So now there needs to be this whole new feast that's dedicated to the birth. And that's what y'all doing next week. So for these apologists, or this week, so when these apologists say, December 12th, we're not celebrating the birth, we're celebrating the incarnation. No, you're not. You're not. Okay? The Feast of Nativity, the Feast of Epiphany is about the incarnation. When Christ became divine. And you got two versions of that. Some churches got at his baptism. The other one saying at his birth, his incarnation, when he took on flesh. That's the January thing. December 25th is all about the day he was born. So when these apologists telling y'all we ain't celebrating the birth of Christ, we celebrate the incarnation, they're lying and they're playing games with y'all. This is all about the birth. The reason why this is important, because if it didn't stand out like a sore thumb then, it stands out like a sore thumb now. Because somebody could make the excuse, well, they was focused on the incarnation there at the Feast of Epiphany. I don't see nothing wrong with that. All right. But now they're like, we need to have a separate feast to emphasize the birth. Now this is emphasis about the birth. The birth, the birth, the birth, the birth. Let's make a feast for it. Then when the question is asked, well, what did the apostles and the believers think about making festivals for birthdays? And then you find out, oh, it was pagan to do so. There was a pagan custom. Oregon saying, oh, only sinners alone make a deal about birthdays. So now when these church fathers, and now they're like, we need to have a separate day that's about a celebration of the birth. Oregon, the apostles, the believers of the first couple of centuries before this whole mind shift happened, they would have all looked at those church fathers and said, y'all are letting go of the strong grip you would have. Now you're making a big deal about something only sinners do. They would have counted those men as sinners, having a sinner mindset to try to combat this heresies that was going on at the time. See, when John was already against those who were trying to say Christ was divine and he didn't come from heaven and he was created, John wrote what we call one of the highest Christology passages in the entire Bible in John 1. And guess what? Though he made the great emphasis to establish the validity and truth that Christ is divine and came from heaven, he didn't make no feast in counteraction to celebrate it. Instead, he just regurgitated, reaffirmed the truth of Christ's incarnation and left it alone. He didn't go, let's make a feast. Now we got candle lit. Now we going to the cave we think he was born at. Now we doing this. They didn't do that. They said, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and nothing would have been created except it had been by him, and then the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. He said those things, but they had no feast, no festival, no celebration to commemorate this event. They didn't do that because their mindsets regarding doing so was that those who make a great emphasis and start making festivals and celebrations about birthdays and stuff like that, or when somebody incarnated, is pagan. Pagan. Its origins from demons. The Epiphany feast started from demons. I'm not talking about the doctrines people attached to it in the new version, where they're emphasizing Christ really did incarnate in flesh. He's really God manifest among us. Not the doctrine they associate with it. The idea of celebrating it with a festival is that the origins of doing so comes from demons who led these Gnostic heretics to start it. God didn't lead the Gnostics to start the Epiphany feast. The demons did. And instead of rejecting the feast, as the church already was, and then just reaffirming the truth about Christ's incarnation, they decided to merge the two. Change their mindset about making a big deal about births and stuff, and continue the way they were at this point. Instead, they adopted the Feast of Epiphany and attached their version of the story to it. Yes, we're actually literally reading that. We're literally reading that. We have sources of people celebrating Christmas. That doesn't matter. That doesn't matter one bit when it comes to what is right and what is wrong. What we're seeing is, as we go through the historical accounts, we're seeing how that mindset shift and how y'all got 2 days from now, because it was not always the case. All right, so be patient, rewind if you got to. Don't start in the middle and start to argue things that's already established. Before Constantine, before the fourth century, there were people already that were celebrating what we call today Christmas, where it's about the birth, not the incarnation, the birth of Jesus Christ. Okay, so that's already a fact. But we're seeing how it got to that point, and we're seeing that the whole idea of focusing on birth and incarnation and making a celebration out of it was the church borrowing from Gnostic heretics who were following the doctrine of demons, who led them to start this. All right, that's where we're at right now. All right, so the time, let's see here. The challenge was not from Gnostics who believed, I think I read it already. Soon after Nicaea, it became desirable for doctrinal reasons for the churches to see the birth of Christ as a separate event from his baptism. Soon after Nicaea, it became desirable for doctrinal reasons, meaning let's give the reason or the cause or the excuse that we're going to be doing this. Doctrinal reasons for the churches to see the birth of Christ as a separate event from his baptism. A second major factor was politics. Having begun his reign by throwing his allegiance into Christianity, Constantine was keenly interested in leading the Roman Empire away from the pagan forms of worship and toward the Christian church. He wanted to unify the empire. That is just factually, historically accurate. He wanted to unify the empire. The Christian faith was the faith that was used to try to do so. He didn't use Mithraism to try to do this. He didn't use one of those other polytheistic religions to do so. He took the monotheistic faith of the children of God. Okay, he took Christianity and then made that a legally accepted practice of worship among the other pagan religions. But then he wanted to unify the empire, so the Christian faith was used as that one faith everybody needed to convert to, so that the empire could be controlled easier. Okay, so it was politics involved. And by the way, for anybody just coming in, this article was written by a pro-Christmas person. He's going through historical things. That's why I'm reading that. Okay. He's just reading it. He's just quoting from the historical sources, showing us how we got from no feast at all, nobody making a big deal about Christ's birthday or incarnation, no feast among the apostles in the first couple of centuries of the church. Then later on, late 2nd century, early 3rd century, you got this Epiphany feast that sprung up from heretics. And then you got church fathers and them start to adopt this and put their own spin on it, to then it all being in January, to now all of a sudden we got a December 25th thing going on. Where did that come from? How we got there? That's what he's walking through. All right. So it says, a second major factor was politics. Having beginning his reign by throwing his allegiance into Christianity, Constantine was keenly interested in leading the Roman Empire away from pagan forms of worship and toward the Christian church. Constantine was neither a theologian nor an evangelist, but he was determined to make imperial policy the servant of both. Make imperial policy the servant of theology and the empire. Okay, so he wanted to unify everything, or vice versa. He was as Coleman points out, not so much a Christian as a conscious syncretist. He strove after the synthesis of Christianity and the valuable elements in paganism. This is what began the Christianization period that we talk about. This is where you get the word syncretism from. Huh? So this is where these things will come. This is where what we call the syncretism and the Christianization period, and you got your like edicts from Pope Gregory I. This is where those things then come in at, as they're going among the Anglo-Saxons and trying to convert those people to the Christian faith. This is where eventually the holy wars spring up, so-called holy wars. This is where those wars come from. All right. So he's just pointing these things out. All right. So because of the political element, and now you have this emperor who's pledging his allegiance to the Christian flag, even though himself not really converted, but he wants this unifying influence over the empire. He now uses the Christian faith to accomplish this. Okay. And so by that, in order, you can't make people believe in Jesus Christ, but if you want to like ransack the empire and make everything one, you have to compromise the faith you're using. This is where syncretism and Christianization comes in at. All right. So about taking the valuable elements in paganism and merging it with the doctrines of Christianity. This is called syncretism. This is how you have people today who are slaves on slave ships in the transatlantic slave trade down in South America that are called they worship the Oxalas and stuff like that. Outwardly, they look like Roman Catholics. When you walk into their churches, you see shrines with Mary and Peter in them, but they're worshiping their African ancestors through the images of Catholic saints. That's called syncretism. This is what was happening during that time. This is the same thing like in Pope Gregory I's letter to his evangelists as they were going among the Anglo-Saxons. It says, take out the relics of the pagans and give them relics of the saints. Take out their images of their false gods and replace them with images of, like Mary or Lady Guadalupe, that type of stuff, Peter and them. Don't let them sacrifice to animals, meaning don't let them sacrifice unto demons, let them offer up sacrifices to God now. And change if their temples are in good condition, convert them into churches. This is called syncretism, taking the valuable elements of paganism and merging it with the Christian faith. Something, when you read the Bible, God did not allow his people to do. When the children of Israel went to the promised land, God did not allow them to just wash off the altars that the idolaters worship Baal on and offer the kids on. Just wash it off, say a prayer, and now they use that to offer sacrifices to God. He said, tear down their altars, tear down their sacred pillars, tear down their groves, destroy every place that they worship on high places or under the groves. He didn't say, look at the valuable elements of the things they use and use it for yourself. Okay? The Lord didn't say that. He said, learn not the way of the heathens. Do not worship me in the way or manner they worship their gods. He said, don't even take the gold off their idols unto yourself, lest you be set aside for destruction as that idol is. So the Lord didn't say, hey, look, the idol is evil, but the gold is not, because I made it. Take the valuable thing of paganism, that gold they had around that little statue, take that necklace off that statue. You can use it in your worship ceremony because the gold, I made it. No, God said, don't even covet the gold that is on it, and don't take it into your possession, lest you be set aside for destruction as it is. That's what the Lord warned. Okay? So when you talk about syncretism, where you're looking at the valuable things of paganism and their practices and adopting it and giving it a little Christian spin, that's contrary to the law of God. It's contrary to what the apostles did. It's contrary to the testimony of Christ. It's contrary to the gospel of Jesus Christ. Men in later centuries think that it's okay because you're centuries removed from the original people who let go of the original mindset. See, you were just born in a corrupt mindset, and you got to come out of it. But there was a time when people shared the same mind as the apostles, but then changed their minds. You didn't have a change your mind experience. You were just born with the wrong kind of mind. Okay? You're just born with the wrong kind of mind. You grew up in a pagan, Gentile-ish household with parents who had a white Jesus. You didn't have this idea of going from God is invisible, have no images, and then you shift your mind and say, you know what, it's okay to have an image. No, you just grew up with images thinking it was normal and it was okay. So you just grew up in a terrible situation. Now you got to come out of it. Okay? So when people say, I don't see nothing wrong with it, it don't matter if you don't see nothing wrong with it, because your view is distorted. Your view is distorted. Okay? So let's go back to this. Remember, as we said in the beginning, the apostle said, hold firmly to that which we handed down to you, whether it be orally or by letter. Okay? Orally or by letter. So this pro-Christian person is saying, hey, listen, the second major factor of us getting the December 25th date thing is politics. Okay? Constantine wanted to unify the empire, and so they looked at the valuable elements of paganism and synthesized it or syncretized it and all that with Christianity. And this is where the nativity got coupled with the worship of the sun in inaugurating the everlasting debate of which festival co-opted which is what we still have to today. Which is what we literally are living through today in our time. Okay? The reason why we have this constant debate every year about the origins of Christmas, and you got one side saying it ain't connected to paganism at all, and the other side saying you adopted paganism rituals and Mithraism and Saturnalia and this and that and this and that. Yuletide festivals. The reason why there's that debate is because the politics behind why the time was even chosen caused this debate. It caused all this confusion. God ain't the author of confusion. Yeah. But the people who thought of this idea to have a December 25th, Jesus' birthday, created all this confusion that we have today. And who are the people who picked it? The apologists love to say this. It wasn't the heathens. They didn't have a date on December 25th. It was the church. The church chose to. Yeah, the church caused this confusion. I'm glad you're admitting that. They're the ones who caused this issue that we got today. And why did they cause this? Because, well, it started off with, let's just separate the nativity from the epiphany that was happening January 5th. But why were y'all doing that on the 5th in the first place? Oh, it's because the Gnostics was around saying that matter was evil and blah, 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 and it distorted the truth about Christ. They had this feast called the Epiphany, but it was rooted in demonic doctrines. So the church, some of the church fathers adopted that idea and had their own spin on it. And so they were doing that for a while until the Arian controversy rose up. When the Arian controversy rose up, then they started to emphasize birth. So they were like, we need to separate and have a whole distinct festival dedicated to the birth of Jesus. So then when they did that shift, it caused this never-ending confusion and debate we got today. See? It didn't bring further clarity. It brought more confusion and arguments and debate. See? So what they thought was a good idea wasn't really a good idea. They should have stayed with the mindset the apostles had. Just reaffirm the validity of the truth of the good news, the truths about Christ, and live holy lives, mark those who go contrary to it, and avoid them. But instead, it's like, no, we got to one-up them. Let's adopt what they did. Let's connect our reasons for it. And then when everything happened in Rome, and now you have the adoption of the Christian faith after the time of Constantine, he makes it legalized first, and then eventually it becomes the empire's religion. And now it's time to convert the empire, make it one. It's a political move. And through conquest, forced conversion, the wars, the swords, threatenings of death, the accept the authority of popes and stuff, all these things start to happen around the same 4th century. 4th, 6th century. These things are happening, okay? And nobody can argue about that. Inspired philosophy can't argue about that. None of these highly intellectual brothers who's ignoring, they're not emphasizing. See, they are mentioned in passing. I've spoken to the chaplain, okay? I've spoken to a lot of these people. They know that the apostles and the church didn't celebrate birthdays at all because they viewed it as idolatry. See? But they mention it in passing, but they don't focus on that because they'll just run to some source where some church fathers started doing it. And then they say, I don't see nothing wrong with it. The Bible doesn't say there's nothing wrong with it. You know the Bible better than the apostles who laid the foundation of faith? You know what Christ wanted? You know what Christ want better than they did? Your mindset today is better than the mindset they had? No, they thought about it the wrong way, Pastor Jay. They were weak in faith. They thought it wrong. It's nothing wrong with birthday celebrations. It's nothing wrong with making a big deal about the day you were born. It's not really a pagan. So they lied. So the doctrines that they were teaching, the mindset that the believers were following, it was falsehood. It was wrong. It wasn't the right way to view it. So now you modern day people come up and say, there's nothing wrong with it. The Bible's silent on the issue. Yeah, the apostles and them didn't do it, but nothing in the Bible says you can't celebrate birthdays. What's wrong with celebrating Christ's birthday? So you reason us out of the mindset that the apostles and them had? That people testify about, that historians write about, that even people who are pro-Christmas acknowledge? Let's keep reading. The Romans had worshipped the sun for hundreds of years, but it was especially the hallmark of the Mithraic cult, or Mithraism. Mithraism was especially popular in the Roman army. And in the 3rd century, and they find the ruins today. So anybody that come around, they'll be like, there was no Mithra worship. They're lying. They got the monuments to this day. But anyway, the Mithraism was especially popular in the Roman army, and in the 3rd century was a serious competitor to Christianity. One of the major festivals of the pagan world was held in honor of the sun on December 25th, the winter solstice. Now, people want to argue. Now, it says on the Julian calendar. That matters because calendars just shifted around in Rome. You had the Julian, then it was edited, then it was the Gregorian. Okay, so take that with a grain of salt. All right, because depending on when you're counting and what calendar was being used at that time, because days were added and subtracted and all this kind of stuff, months were shifted around. So it really depends where you're talking from. But the point is that it's saying that Mithraism was popular and was a real competitor against the Christian faith during this time. And they had a feast on December 25th. Some sources say it was there. Other sources say it wasn't there. So depending on what road of map you're going to go down, somebody's going to say, well, I agree with Pastor Jay. He's got sources. And then somebody will say, oh, well, I agree with this person because they got sources that says there was none. There's no evidence. They love to say that. There's no evidence. They can't say it didn't exist. They can't say it wasn't the case. They say there's just no evidence. There's no evidence. Or they'll use the argument of like one of the evidences might be like a secondary witness person, not the primary person, right? So they use those ideas, and we should understand this, brothers and sisters. Okay, we should understand this, brothers and sisters. Evidence, meaning physical evidence, that's for men to establish things, like in a law sense, or to establish, hey, we got these witnesses, 2 or 3 witnesses, it establishes a matter. That's for men. The witnesses themselves don't determine if something actually happened. They're just witnesses of what happened and they testify. Okay? So that's what the point of witnesses is. Evidence, you can have evidence for something. Like there could have been a loss, there could have been a society that got wiped out in the past. And we have no evidence of these people today. But that doesn't mean they didn't exist at one point. Okay? That's why when people keep digging in the dirt, stuff they be like, we ain't got no evidence for, and they write all these books. They got to keep up with their knowledge because they discover more things. So then you got a 10th edition of some historical book that now, when the previous 9 editions said there's no evidence, the 10th edition says, now we've found new evidence. That this thing that the first 9 editions said there was no evidence for, now there's evidence for it. So all the highly intellectual people who was using all the 9 editions and standing in their chairs and be like, there's just no evidence for it. When the 10th evidence come, they look like straight clowns. Because what it shows is they didn't really know the truth. That's what it shows. They didn't really know the truth. They didn't really know facts. They based their facts based upon what they could understand at that time. But what it shows is they didn't really know the truth. So they got to update themselves and keep up with all the scholarly findings. Because what they say is the case now may not be the case tomorrow. Okay? That's what I got to understand about it. That's why I'll put all my hope in these editions and people's findings in the dirt. See? When trying to determine what is right and the right mindset that the people of God should have. And on based upon that, if you rely upon that, your whole ideas can change tomorrow, depending on what they dig from the dirt and what they say and what the new edition says. Because you got to keep up. If you be intellectual and scholar person, you got to keep up with the supposed evidences and stuff. That's why a lot of stuff is probabilities and likely and theories. But when we talk about the law of God, and Josephus says the law does not allow us to permit us to make festivals for our children's birth. Now we're going to something that's concrete, that stands for all generations. The law of God. What does he teach us? The wise men of old, like the wisdom of Solomon, all right, that he spoke about, that was a real kind of in Ecclesiastes. He's talking about the day of death is greater than the day of one's birth. That spans throughout all generations. I don't have to rely upon people finding things in the dirt and update a book for me to understand this. This is what it says. You ponder on those things, then you'll grow in wisdom, become more wiser, and understand what is right, just, and good. See, if they had to stay with the day of death, it's more important than the day of birth. Then follow that pattern that Christ himself said. He's the one that was born. He's the king of the Jews. Yeah, he didn't say, come, celebrate, remember, I was incarnate. Come, bring gifts to me each year while I'm among you. And when I'm gone, keep giving gifts. Like, he didn't do that. Instead, it said Christ's mindset was set on the day of death. Because of the glory ahead of him, he didn't despise the shame of the cross. Because of the glory ahead of him, he left his case in God's hand when people did evil to him, and he didn't sin or deceive or did any kind of evil to people. See, because he was so focused on the day of death, the day in which man will become immortal through his death. His mind was focused on that. He came down from heaven. As he said, I was sent from heaven. Not do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. And this is the will of him. So God the Father sent down Jesus Christ from heaven And the focus of the mission was to die. That's why Christ didn't give no credence. He didn't give no special occasion to when he was born. So Christ, now he got that mindset. He passed that down to his disciples. They got the mindset. So they don't make no feast to remember the incarnation, the birth, the birth, the birth, the birth. Let's have a whole celebration. Let's do candles and trees now. Let's go to the cave that we think Jesus Christ is born at every year and sing hymns. They didn't do none of that. They didn't do any of that. The first couple of centuries of the church, they followed that same mindset and pattern, frame of thought, frame of mind. Then all of a sudden, over there in the corner somewhere, a few leaders trying to combat Gnosticism, who had a feast called Epiphany already, but rooted in demonic doctrines, said we're going to adopt that and give it our meaning for it to combat theirs. It became competition now. See? You could have just affirmed the truth and stayed with the same mindset. We're not going to make a big deal like they did. Look how Satan has carried them off. No, instead it's like, oh, let's have a feast day, combat that, and blah, blah, blah. Then as time grew, it got worse. Another group rises up, Arianism. Then I got to combat that. Now they're like, well, we need to separate the elements of this feast that we made and make a whole separate feast to focus on the birth, the birth, the birth. And now we got the never-ending debate every year. That's what this is showing. How this all came to be. One of the major festivals of the pagan world was held in the honor of the sun on December 25th, on winter solstice in the Julian calendar. The Feast of the Sun on December 25th was deeply embedded in Roman culture, and celebrants marked it with a great bonfires to hasten the sun's return. There was no way Christians in the Roman Empire could either ignore or eradicate the pagan festival of light. So their preachers sought to use it to proclaim its own message. The same way that some of these leaders use MMA to try to proclaim their messages. So now they got fight church ministries where people beating each other up on Saturdays and with the hope to evangelize, to bring the people that was there for fighting to come to church the next day to receive Jesus. See, they use that for the platform. They do the same thing with boxing. They do the same thing for WWE. They do the same thing with the basketball and the thing. The Christians, they be itching, ready to perform at the Super Bowl because they want to use that as a platform so much for Jesus. And they don't preach against the evils going on around them. They just want to perform to talk about Jesus Christ, and they're wearing the jerseys. They're in the stands rooting on whoever. They're not having the mindset that the apostles had, the believers had. Tertullian wrote a whole book about it. They ain't got the mindset of these men. They got a whole different mindset while proclaiming Christ. A whole nother kind of Jesus who allows a whole different kind of living. That's what they're promoting. So they couldn't get rid of it. Now you got to imagine here, because obviously we're talking about a time period that preceded us. You can watch documentaries and stuff to get a kind of picture of this, but then they have cameras like we got now. So you got to imagine a little bit when you're reading these things. Imagine you got a whole empire with multitudes of polytheistic religions there, and you got majority of people don't even believe in Jesus. You got these groups that do believe in Jesus, but as the apostle said, Lord, who has believed our report? To whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? So the only way that you can actually become a Christian is to convert by believing on Christ, because Christ don't count false conversions. So you had to hear the good news and then faith comes. So, but if you got a whole polytheistic nation, you want to unify it under one umbrella, and here's this faith you're going to use, but that faith, you only really can convert to it truly by heart, not by just somebody forcing you to do so. But if you want to use it, what do you have to do in order to get rid of the other polytheistic ideas in the empire? You have to syncretize. You have to Christianize. Okay? You have to take the valuable elements of paganism, merge it with the Christian faith. And hey, that wasn't foreign to the church. That wasn't foreign to the church because they already did it with the Epiphany feast. They already did it with the Epiphany feast. So that's not foreign to them. They already did it. They already was doing this. Okay? So then, there was no way the Christians in the Roman Empire could either ignore or eradicate the pagan festival of light. There was a way they could ignore it. See, I don't like that part. There's a way they could have ignored it. See? When the apostle says, have no fellowship in the evil works of darkness, but rather expose them by the godly lives you live. That's the way you avoid. That's the way you resist, by not partaking. Okay? Continue to not partake. Remain separate. That's how you avoid it. But if you have a faith that has now become political, and now it's got this political element, political power and influence, there's no way that they could run the empire as Christians and ignore the things that were going on in the empire concerning the other polytheistic religions. So they have to do something with it. And that's where the forced conversions and the wars and holy wars and all that stuff comes through. Oh man, that stuff is so disheartening when you're reading it. Okay? But nevertheless, the preacher sought to use it to proclaim his own message, perhaps in the hope of someday supplanting it. They would make reference to the prophecy of Son of Righteousness in Malachi 4:2, or to Simeon's song, which acclaimed Christ as the light of the Gentiles, Luke 2:32. Ambrose and Millian preached a sermon contrasting the pagan and Christian celebrations, calling Christ our new son. His more illustrious protege, Augustine, admonished his flock to worship on not the Son, the actual Son, December 25th, but to him who created the Son. Now, this part is important because the argument that a lot of apologists make that there was no pagan festival on December 25th, and you know, that's just made up, and everything's so pure and Christian in origin. If that's true, why would there be writings of ministers during that time frame that are literally admonishing Christians to not worship the actual Son with the pagans on the same day, but rather worship Christ the Son? If there was no literal pagan festival during this time frame, there'd be no point to do that contrast on that day. Okay? In the 5th century, Pope Leo the Great upbraided Christians who celebrated December 25th as the birth of the Son, S-U-N. So there clearly was the pagan, you know, idolatry, December 25th thing going on at this time. But rather, celebrate the birth of Christ instead. Okay? So you see this tug of war that's happening. Clearly, these church leaders did not invent these associations between Christ and the S-U-N Son. The pagans are already worshiping the Son, but they were trying to keep control of them. They didn't invent the association. They were trying to keep control of it. Okay? Besides, the theme of the light of the world was already embedded in the Christian message, going back to the teaching of John. So what you have to understand is that even though this person at the end talk about, you know, this, like, the history and all that, you know, they don't see nothing wrong with it and celebrate the birth of Christ and goo gaga, Care Bear doctrine. Even though he does that, nevertheless, when he's going through the historical lead up to it, what you get to see in that church history, where did the mindset shift from where we have factual evidence and proof from multitudes in the church, out the church, that the apostles of Jesus Christ didn't celebrate Jesus' birth, they didn't make a big deal about birthdays in general, and that goes all the way back to the time of Moses, and for the first couple of centuries of the church unifiedly held the same position, to now all of a sudden, now we got today people going, I don't see what's wrong with it. If they held tight to what the apostles held down, there'd be no people today, if they were holding on to what the apostles established in the mindset that Christ taught everybody. There would have been nobody talking about, I don't see no wrong with some birthdays. They would hold their unifying thought that we do all see something wrong with it because it comes from superstitious pagan idolatry. And so we're going to stay with the same mindset that the apostles of Jesus had, that Jesus had when he was walking the earth, that even backtracking back to Moses and Job and David and Abraham. These people that we hear about, they never did it, even though the heathens around them were doing it, but they themselves didn't do it. Then we have Jesus Christ. He's born, but he ain't worrying about it. His apostles don't establish a day. There's no day for him even the whole time he's alive. And then when he finally gets ready to leave, he then tells us what to remember, what is important that we must remember about him. And he institutes the communion and gave no thought to the day he was born, even though we know he had to be born in order to die, because only as a human being could he die. But yet he didn't make a deal of it and say, now establish a festival for the day I was born. Do that for when I was born and when I died, because there's a thought pattern that comes with these things. See? And if the apostles of Jesus Christ viewed it as pagan, meaning demonic in origin, contrary to anything that comes from God, and leads people astray into vain superstitions and idolatries, which is why the Christians today that don't see nothing wrong with celebrating birthdays, y'all dealing with the issue of people seeing nothing wrong with horoscopes. Okay? And now y'all trying to have Christmas and celebrate the birthday of Jesus while also trying to tell brothers and sisters, come away from horoscope, it's witchcraft. Like, the reason why y'all dealing with that is because y'all ain't stay with the mindset the apostles had. See, if you had viewed the day of death greater than the day of birth and make no deal about birthdays, you ain't had to worry about horoscopes or Christmas. See? But because you're trying to have one while trying to stay away from the other, but you can't really keep control of that. So you got Christians walking around talking about what's your sign? I'm Capricorn, I'm a Sagittarius, and all kind of stuff. I'm a Pisces. It's because they've already fallen into the trap of Satan that comes from superstitious practice of the heathens and idolatry. See? If you let the grip go a little bit, you'll let the grip go more. That's why you use that example. You say, hold a strong grip. See, when a person's holding on the handlebars and got a strong grip, he not letting go. But if you start shaking and your little bit of fingers start give grip, guess what? Eventually, the whole hand gives grip. Because as you let grip go a little bit, it gets harder on the rest of your fingers and stuff to hold up the weight. So therefore your arm gets weaker and weaker, and then you eventually let go, i.e. great falling away. Great falling away didn't take place overnight. It happened over time as people were letting go grips. Letting go the grip. Let the grip go a little bit. Oh, matter is evil. Start letting the grip go a little bit. Then it becomes, well, then Christ couldn't have incarnate in flesh because he'd be evil now. So then you let go. Now you let go of that. Got a whole nother Jesus. Now all of a sudden the whole faith has been corrupted. Then you got one side viewpoint. Oh, we're not making a deal about birthdays. It's pagan. Only sinners think like that. Only sinners make a big deal of births. So all of a sudden you start letting that go a little bit because you're like, well, let's take the Epiphany feast and give it our own spin. Start let go. Then all of a sudden the Arian controversy rises up. Then you're like, well, we need to separate the feast to make a whole distinct thing about births. And all of a sudden you go from making no deal about births and make a celebration to now celebrate the births to where now when Christians are interacting with one another, and then there's a Christian that hears another Christian don't celebrate Christmas, they're looking at them as if they're really Christians or not. And that's only because they let go of the grip. They let go of the grip way back then. And simply they let the grip go, over time it got harder to hold on. And so now more and more corruptions, more and more letting go, i.e. falling away. That's literally what the falling away is. And so this article is pointing these things out. And so now you got people like the Jesus Saves guy in that comment section that I showed at the earlier class saying, really, the people that are anti-Christmas, most of them that's anti-Christmas is really because they denied Christ's deity. What? You got generations upon generations upon generations of Christians who believed in every way that Jesus Christ was divine and was God manifested in the flesh, who literally made no deal about his incarnation or birth. Now today, because the let go didn't happen so bad, now you actually sitting there talking about most of the people who reject Christmas because they really reject Jesus' deity. See, that sounds smart for your generation, but when we contrast what you're saying to the apostles' mindset, their doctrines, the writings of the wise men and the prophets, and the Psalms, and the law of God, and then the character of the way the Christians lived, we see you're the ones who's letting go. See? But the issue we have is that when the politics became involved, and then it became the big worldwide thing it is today, it became what is more widely acceptable and became what is the cultural norm. And when you're talking about going against cultural norms, it's always a black sheep type of situation, and majority of people are going to go with the cultural norm. Hold on now, where's the thing at? Oh, most people are going to go with the cultural norm, okay? And so when it comes to making a deal about birthdays, though it's the cultural norm, it's actually anti the Bible, anti the apostles' doctrine, anti the apostles' mindset, which, and the Apostle Paul said, imitate me as I imitate Christ. So the mindset the apostle had, along with his doctrines, the way he lived his life, we are to imitate that, because then we can be assured we're imitating Christ. So in every generation, those who imitate the acts of the apostles, the ones who continue to have the same mindset, preach the same doctrines, the truths about Christ, how you should avoid the evils and all these things, the pure, wholesome living, the ones who are teaching that and then be an example of that, those are the ones you should follow their examples and their doctrines, because they're the ones that you can be assured is imitating Christ. See? But when the apostles said, so when we read the apostles didn't allow Christians to go, for example, to the theaters or to the Colosseums or to the brother brought up earlier, the Circus Maximus. They didn't allow them to go to these places because they're full of idolatry and paganism. The only time the Christians were brought in there, if they didn't apostatize, was when they were being persecuted. Now, in modern day, when you got a bunch of these leaders talking about it's nothing wrong with that, and there's nothing wrong with the Olympics, the Bible doesn't explicitly say, then you could see the people who have let go, and some of them let go on purpose, and some of them just grew up under those traditions that were a byproduct of people who let things go. So that's all they know is that tradition that they got. Okay? But they got to come out of those things. They gotta contrast the doctrine and actions and lifestyle of the apostles who directly saw the Lord, who imitated him, whose testimonies we got, and then contrast whether we are doing the same so that we can know whether we're holding firmly to what they handed down, or else we're relying upon men who might have held on to some things Christ said, but have let go of others. And when you live that kind of life of letting things here and there go, your grip gets harder to hold on to, and that leads to the falling away. Okay? Inspired philosophy will cook you. Have a nice day. I hope I taste good after it. All right. I hope I taste good after it. All right. You're probably so carnal minded. All right. Y'all always looking for some just good debate, somebody to woo you with their information. All right. We're talking about the law of God, the mind of the apostles. Here's the thing. Inspired philosophy is as wise as he may seem. Okay. He himself will have to agree with me that it's historically factual that the apostles and the first centuries of the church didn't even make a deal about birthdays at all. Then when the question is asked is why? Why didn't he make a deal about it? If he was intellectually honest, then he'll also admit that the reason they avoided it is because they viewed it as it being pagan and idolatrous. Okay, then, hold that still. Where the idea can change at? Then let him woo you with your information, because you're so quick to try to latch onto something that justifies your loose grips. Okay? Your loose grips. But the way that the apostles of Jesus Christ lived their lives and told us to imitate, and being the fact that we all know, hey, we living in the last days and the great falling away, then you ought to be extra careful of what kind of Jesus you believe in and what kind of lifestyle your Jesus promotes. Because if it ain't the Jesus the apostles talked about, and if the life you live isn't in accordance to the teachings that Jesus laid down, then you will not inherit his kingdom. Let me see if I have something else here. I want to show you this from the same article. I want to point it out. I want to emphasize this. The slow, gradual influence of what y'all doing tomorrow, 2 days from now. Talking about the establishment of December 25th and Christmas and blah, 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 blah. That was the Western churches under the influence of Rome. The Western churches under the influence, meaning the political influence, of Rome. The Eastern churches, however, were not so eager to separate the nativity from the epiphany. So you see that when Christmas became more popular, or was starting to become popular, it was once this obscure feast that not everybody held to, people was anti and contrary to. So I mean, at one point, Christmas was the minority. The majority of people were opposed the idea. That's why I want y'all to understand. Whereas today, the people who oppose Christmas is outliers. The people that say there's nothing wrong with it is the majority of society. But there was a time when it was reversed. When the idea was introduced and people started to practice it, majority of the churches in the Christian world were opposed to this idea of Christmas. Okay? But it grew in popularity because of the influence of pagan Rome that now merged with the Christian faith. And this is how, especially when the Roman Empire collapsed and eventually you have the proper powers rise up. This is how all of a sudden they became the spokesperson for all things Christians. They did a spokesperson for everything Christians. Their denomination or ideas is the largest out of all the Christian sects in the world. And we know through the conquest and all those things, that's how they spread so fast. So, and their influence over here in the Western world took place greatly as a result of the slave trade, because many of the Christians who were on the slave ships were already converts to Catholicism. And so they brought the Catholicism. I brought about the people in South America. I brought up the people in South America who worshiped the Azallas and things like that. They're Roman Catholics under Catholicism, but they worship African ancestors because their tribal ancestors, were converted through their forceful conversions, through different wars and stuff, unto Catholicism. They were threatened with death if they didn't convert to Catholicism. So their ancestors converted to Catholicism, but retained their oral traditions of their ancestors. And the people who were under Catholicism when the slave trade took place worship African ancestors, still idolaters. And so they brought that over into this world, new world. And that's why in South America you have the Exalas and the Orexas and things like that. So, so it's a very condensed cobweb history concerning the church history. But what you get to see when you do look at it is you start off from the starting point, the doctrine handed down by the apostles, the mindset that came with those doctrines, the pattern of life the Christians did as a result of that doctrine. And then when you read the preceding timelines of things, you see the slow drift away from that thing that was first established. That's what you're watching. Because if the apostles was true, which I believe, and the prophecy said was true, which I believe, then the falling away had to happen. In order for that to happen, many antichrists had to come into the world. Antichrist means people who pervert the good news about Christ. And you best believe that the only things perverted about Jesus wasn't the epiphany and the birthday. That was the only thing perverted about Jesus, okay? So when the apostles talk about, many antichrists in the world and things like that, and perverting the good news about Christ and all these kinds of stuff, in many ways they did that. So it's not these two main things, the Arian controversy, the Gnosticism. It's more than that, okay? More than that. And even today, because councils don't stop people from perverting the good news. So even though we don't have no modern council, the Council of New York, 2025, that doesn't stop antichrist spirits from perverting the good news, okay? So there's more and more ways that people continue to pervert the good news in a way that Christians should live post these councils that people hold on to, okay? Where different decisions were made and things like that. And so this is important to understand. I wanted to take today to talk about these things because statements that's made December 25th, we're not celebrating the birth of Christ. We're celebrating the incarnation. That's what they're saying to their audiences. But here's the thing. They didn't make up the feast. The people who are saying that didn't make up the feast. Okay? The people who determined December 25th was going to be this particular feast day, why did they establish it? Because that's why you're doing it. Okay? And they said, we need to separate the birth from the epiphany. So December 25th is about the birth. So don't come and say, December 25th, we celebrate the birth, we celebrate the incarnation. You're lying and being dishonest. You didn't make up the feast, see? You're just falling in line with everybody else, see? If you was really celebrating the incarnation, you wouldn't be doing it in December. You wouldn't even have presents. You wouldn't have no Magi story. You wouldn't have no being born of a virgin because the incarnation got nothing to do with being born. The day of birth, it got nothing to do with it. It got nothing to do with the Magi following a star. Because the star didn't appear until he was born, not when he was incarnate in it. Okay? So they're lying to you, but because they threw all these sources up, You know, people eat it up because Christmas ain't pagan. So whatever they read that say Christmas ain't pagan, or some church follower was doing it in some central century or something like that, that's enough to appease the people who already want to do Christmas. You're already going to do Christmas anyway. You're already going to do it. So anything to latch on to, yeah. Y'all hold on to the strangest of myths. Like a person died on the day we were born. Y'all hold on to the strangest of stories to make your excuses. You believe a man chopped down the tree and then a little fir grew up and he told the heathens to take that into their house to represent Jesus Christ for Christmas. Y'all believe that? Y'all believe that? Just like when that minister wrote about Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer to embellish the story of Christmas and Jesus' birthday and the legend of Saint Nick. And now all of a sudden, all your kids are singing Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. I don't see nothing wrong with that because Christmas is about Jesus' birth. No, it ain't about the birth no more. It's about the incarnation. But the people who established the feast said it's about the birth. You didn't establish the feast. Y'all ain't got no power to establish the feast and what it's for. The people who established it has the power. So what did they say it's for? They said it's a celebration of the birth of the Christ child. That's why you're doing it. Stop lying to yourself and everybody else. Now, since they told you it's about the celebration of the birth of the Christ child, and they purposely made it its own distinct thing to battle the Arian controversy, now let me ask you this question again as I get ready to leave y'all today. What was the apostles of Jesus Christ's view about making a deal about birthdays and establishing festivals for them? What did Origen say? What did Josephus say? What did Tertullian say? What did they say? Only sinners do that, not saints. The same way Tertullian would tell you Christian apologists that doing y'all live streams with your dumb jerseys and stuff on, Tertullian would say, y'all are living lives contrary to your baptism profession. You use his writings to try to establish how Christianity is the right man's religion, but the same man would condemn your very faith that you claim you got because of the way you live your life. And then you make excuses for it, talking about the Bible is explicit, it's quiet. You know, Paul used boxing as a metaphor, therefore we can go literally box people. Like, y'all make those kind of excuses. They be like, bro, these dudes are deceivers. They don't know the Lord. They don't know the Lord, really. They have a profession, but they're starting to create hypocrites. But when they go online, it's all about the Bible. It's all, look at their attitudes. Look how they look. They're entertainers, okay? I grew up in the entertainment world. I know what it means to be an entertainer. They're entertainers. They ain't just evangelizing. No, they got to evangelize in a costume. And they got to do stupid stuff. Yeah, I'm cooking you today. They got to do that to entertain y'all. They evangelize and they get online. It's all about the Bible. And then their camera focuses on their whole background. And in the background on the shelves, you see Predator mask, Thor poster. They're a little fan of Thor's brother. What was his name is? I don't know his name. I know he got Odin, Thor, and then Loki. A little Loki doll right there. They got a little ticket from when they went to Comic-Con. They got a little picture when they took a picture with Storm from X-Men. They got this little they got the Indian Dream Saver thing on their wall. They got all this going on. And then in their garments, they got the basket from the Black Panther movie, which is doggone the guy who took on the image of the Bastet, the daughter of Ra, who led him to a heart-shaped herb that he became the protector of Wakandan race. They got the hat on because they fans of the movie. Then they got the jerseys on because they, Carolina Panther fans. And then they got the shoes on. They got the socks. They be online. They be like, I know y'all watching the game, but y'all trash. But this all about the Bible. It's all about the Bible. That's what we be dealing with, man. It's annoying. Then when you try to deal with the issues, they don't want to deal with that. They don't want to collaborate on stuff they agree with you on. No. You want to deal with the issues, ain't no collaborating either. Because to avoid the issues and only focus on collaborating, meaning we continue to have this art between us, really? It's kind of like the Pharisees and scribes, right? Where they're in this room, right? Because the Sanhedrin, they're there. The Apostle Paul is there, right? And it looked like they're all agreeing, right? Because they collaborating together because they're against the apostles, right? Because this whole thing about Jesus springing up. So they all together, they collaborating. The apostle look around and saw that some of them were Pharisees, some of them were Sadducees. He said, brethren, I too believe in the afterlife. And then the whole room erupted. Whole room erupt. Because the Pharisees believed in spirits in the afterlife, where the Sadducees did not. So then they went from their collaboration to arguing with each other. And that's the way it is now. They try to avoid stuff, slide it all in this imaginary, preferential, non-essential box, and then try to only focus on what they, I guess, agreed the essentials are. Collaborate on that, though they got all these huge issues in the so-called non-essential realm. And then before everybody else, it looked like, oh, we just so agreement. It's all about the Bible. It's this and that and this and that. And all it takes is one word, one sentence to be said, and the whole room erupts. Now they argue at each other. They forgot the common goal they were there for, because now something's been said where they can't stand together no more. They got to argue now. That's the way it is now. And so there are those who want to deal with the issues and not let the issues go, because they know Christ's prayer was that the church be unified in thought, intent, and in purpose. And as long as we're warring with each other about different things, that unity is impossible to have. So now you're forced to do a couple of things. You can continue to try to rectify these issues, which is what you should do at first. Try to rectify these issues so that everybody come into oneness, all right? In thought and in deed, because what you think, doctrinally speaking, will also reflect or also influence how you live spiritually, okay? And so either continue to deal with these issues so you may all become one in your thought and intent and purpose, or you're going to keep opposing each other, and as you continue to oppose one another, keep arguing, bickering, back and forth, 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 y'all end up having this fake love toward one another, where you say, you love one another, but really, y'all ain't gonna break bread together like that, because behind the scenes, you think each other is a heretic and out of order, and you refuse to turn away from your out of orderness, and God ain't the God of confusion. And okay, who is the God of confusion? The devil. So the devil's in the mix, but we don't want to get rid of the devil. So let's kind of ignore the devil. Keep one of us or both of us still be led by the devil, because the confusion that's there, still be under his deception and stuff. Let's not really focus on it. Let's just talk about stuff we like, that we agree about. And guess what's going to happen? While the devil's still working behind the scenes in your so-called non-essential box, you're going to grow further and further apart, further and further apart, further and further apart. Then he deceive y'all, because instead of y'all just becoming blatant enemies and killing one another or denouncing one another, no, he make you feel like y'all still friends. Y'all still friends. Y'all still fighting for the common cause. So now he invented this whole idea of essential or non-essential box. Then when you ask the person, where's this list at? The apostle didn't hand us down this kind of list here. Where is it? Then, it depends on what church you at. So you mean so at my church here, Church of Texas, participating in competitive sports is essential doctrine, because to do so requires that we let go the blatant teachings of Christ, like not being hostile, thinking of others as better than yourself, not trying to impress others, not being selfish in your ambitions, not giving it, not falling into the trap of trash talking and trying to take advantage of people. And like those teachings that Christ gave, participating in competitive sports, you literally can't do those things without departing from those teachings from Christ. So participating in competitive sports is a no-no here. But somewhere else, that made an excuse. We can use it as a platform. It's just a game. The Bible ain't explicitly condemn it. So now they're over there. So competitive sports participation is non-essential to them. So over here, it's departing from the faith and the character that the Lord has told us to live by, and you must repent. Over there, it's not a sin, and so it's non-essential. But the devil made you think, well, we ain't gonna see eye to eye. You can think I'm departing, from the Lord's teachings. And I can think I'm staying with the Lord's teachings, but we are brothers. That's stupid. That is complete, utter stupidity. To say it's okay, the topic is non-essential, and you can think I'm departing from the faith, and I can think I'm in the faith. It's not essential. We're still brothers. This isn't a reason to disassociate. That what? Something is wrong with these folks. No, you don't think it's a matter of separation. For the person who thinks you're departing from the faith and going contrary to the teachings of Christ, and when they try to bring it up, you making excuses and saying the Bible don't explicitly condemn this, and now y'all at war. They're the ones that's going to be distancing themselves because you are the person, from their standpoint, that's leaving the faith or holding to the faith, but is falling away of the doctrine of demons. And so they're trying to warn you. So at the end of the day, you don't think you're doing bad. They believe you're doing bad. Every person, well, this person saying, kind of arguing from silence. The Bible doesn't explicitly condemn, which is not true. But it doesn't completely condemn. The other people saying it does completely condemn. This teaching Christ, this Christian Christ, this teaching apostle, this way of life. They didn't allow them to go there because it's full of this. It's still full of this now. As a matter of fact, it's more full of it now. So it's because of this. And then the person rejects it. No, but we're still brothers. You're not living like brothers. And from this standpoint, they're starting to question whether you're really a brother or not. Because this ain't a matter of meat, where something is an actual liberty, but somebody's weak in conscience, and they think that it's unlawful to eat a certain type of meat because of, coming from under the law or whatever cases. They think it's defiled them or something. This ain't that kind of matter where the subject matter is actually nothing evil in itself, but it's somebody's personal weak conscience that makes them feel like something's wrong with it. When we're talking about hostility and violence and boxing and all that stuff, those things are evil in themselves. Hostility against your neighbor for fun. Even if you was mad and they insulted you, to be revenged or be hostile towards them, then it's still evil. So it's evil in itself. So if the Gentiles take that thing that's evil in itself and make a game surrounding it, therefore that game is evil. Now, if there's something like, let's say, fishing, which isn't evil in itself, people do that to eat. People do it together. They get in a boat. They do it all together and catch food and go eat. Thank God. That's not evil in itself. People call that sport, whatever. So, hey, you're in a boat, fish together, nothing wrong with that. Catch food, thank God, eat. But if somebody takes that thing that is good and then corrupt the activity and say, all right, now, instead of being together, man, let's try to see who the best. Okay, let's try to see the best. So then now, because it's all about who's the best, and now it's about a prize or a glory that you can't share together, now the evil one who's introduced this, now you're giving room for him to lead you into further lawless activities, like trying to gain the advantage by hitting him in the stomach, or holding on to his jersey so he can't run too much, or like them guys in the fishing thing, where they add weights. They catch the fish, put weights in them so that he can weigh more. So when they get to the scale, it seems like the fish is bigger than what it really is. And the only reason that they ended up doing that, Satan led them into cheating, is because the very thing they were participating in is trying to prove they're the best. So they try to think of ways to gain the advantage. This is why in tournament fishing, for example, for those who fish, this is why for a long time, up until recent years, why the use of live scopes was not allowed. Because you have people that weren't using scopes at all, and then you have people that was just using those sonar scopes that just gave you snapshot pictures in the water. Now you got this thing called live scope where you could just have the little rod, put it in the water, turn it around and see in real time where your bait line at, where the fish at. That's a huge advantage. But people started to use it to gain that advantage, and eventually you couldn't really outdo it because the technology was advancing, so they started to incorporate it. Okay? So, and before that became a big thing, you have men who would go out in the water a day before the tournament starts mark out the little spots where the fish was at. They would catch fish. They would take ropes and mount the fish to the rope, put the fish back in the water. The fish is just hovering around. They'll mark the spot. So then when the tournament comes and it's about, whoever get the first 5 bass, first 5 fish, get a prize, get a couple $100 or a couple $1,000. They would then go to those spots where they previously stored fish at, sit there for a little minute, act like they're catching the fish in real time. Oh, I got a fish. Take a picture of it, send it in so they can win the bag. And why were they doing that? Because they were in that competitive mindset and they're trying to gain advantages. Satan led them further into lawlessness. And so now hostility, rivalry, deceit, jealousy, envy, all manner of wickedness began to happen simply because there was a shift in attitude. Instead of, let's do this together, get the fish, thank the Lord, we just fishing, it's activity, thank the Lord, we just enjoy the sport together. No, it's about me being better than you, brother. Me being a better person than you. Then it went from fishing, which is a thing of chance. Fishing is a thing of chance, like casting lots. You fish, it's a thing of chance. It's not a guarantee you're going to catch a fish, no matter what bait you use. So you go out there and you throw out your net or you throw out your rod for the hopes that God would bless you with fish. And it went from catching the fish, oh, thank God, reel it in, thank God, put it in a bucket and eat, to now people walk around like, I'm the best fisherman. And they're getting the endorsements and all that. This is the best fisherman, and he's gloating and he's this and that and this and that. This whole thing is a game, it's a sport of chance. Meaning you don't determine if you're catching a fish. God does. So really, it's a matter of who God has favor on, not what human is the best. But that's the way that the Gentiles think. But the apostles didn't live like that. That's why I'm warning you, brothers and sisters. That's why I'm on here for so long, emphasizing about this mindset the apostles talked about. And at the end of the day, the real proof of who's following the Lord is the character and how they act. See? What way leads to unity, peace? Which decisions that are made leads to the body becoming unified to where y'all ain't even got no arguments? I ain't talking about me and my clique over here ain't arguing, but we still got this group over here. Because let's say I'm in the middle. Let's say I'm not pro or against. I'm kind of up in the air like, I don't know. And I'm determined which route to go. And my whole focus is, which way leads to peace between the brethren? Which way leads to righteous living, growing in faith? All these things the apostle talk about. And I observe, if I join this side and do it, I'm guaranteed to have bickerings from the other side. If I join the side that didn't do it, and if these so-called people who think it's a liberty, if they put into practice the teachings of Romans 14, since they think it's a Romans 14 issue, and then they themselves discard it because of their weaker brethren who think it's wrong, if we all went that direction, there'd be no arguing. Even if people still thought it was no problem, but because they saw their brothers upset and vexed about this, and they think it's a Romans 14 issue, so therefore they don't think a holiday is greater than the unity they should have with their brethren, no different than a piece of meat is not greater than the unity with their brethren, therefore they should lay aside this meat, even though there's technically nothing wrong with doing it, for the sake of their brethren. If they put Romans 14 into practice for real, there'll be no arguing. So just by looking at it, like, which way leads to peace? Avoiding it. Because by participating, it brings in all this confusion. Where it come from? Where the idea come from? It's connected to this. Y'all are pagans. If I don't do it, nobody can accuse me of being a pagan. Nobody can say I'm following Constantine in Rome. Nobody can say that. Nobody can say you've let go the mindset of the apostles who made no deal about birthdays if I myself am not making deals about birthdays. I don't have to worry about somebody coming along and saying, hey, you're an idolater for participating in the Olympics. If I kept the same mindset of the apostles in the Lord's church who avoided those places because it's full of idolatry and paganism, I wouldn't have to worry about it. Which way? That's why the scripture says, carefully determine what pleases the Lord. Not carefully determine what you think will please the Lord, but what carefully pleases the Lord. That requires you have to meditate on his word. You have his verbatim commands, but you also have the words of wisdom in the prophets and in the Psalms. And then you have the doctrines of the apostles and the mindset they told you to have. So now when you talk about this mindset you should have, if I really think people better than myself and I don't want to harm my neighbor and I want to love my enemy, there'll never be this thought that I would strap gloves on and find it reasonable to step in the ring and fight the person. Like for game or for real. If he slapped me across my face, there's still no thing in us as believers that should go, we should find it acceptable to, put some wrapping around our hands and go bare knuckle fist fighting. Because we need to put into practice the teachings that Christ and his apostles handed down to us. That's what we're talking about, the mindset, okay? Not the traditions of men that craftily sidestep God's commandments, but the mindset that we should have, okay? So as you saw in the writings, it said the Western churches that were under the influence of Rome did the whole December 25th thing, but not all the Eastern churches. Some churches were more stubborn to separate the Epiphany feast into two separate things. Okay, and even to today, that's still the same. That's still the case today. Even though Christmas is worldwide now, but it's still churches that don't do Christmas on December 25th. They do everything, the birth, the incarnation, all that, on the Feast of Epiphany in January. Okay, but the history of how they even began to do that is because church fathers adopted the pagan Epiphany feast idea from the Gnostics who were already doing it with their false doctrines about matter being evil and stuff like that, and the incarnation happening at the baptism. So any way you slice the bread, it didn't begin with orthodoxy. What happened is people let orthodox mindsets go and adopted things that pagans and people that were following the doctrine of the demons were practicing, and they adopted it for themselves. So either way, it's the same thing that has occurred. All right. Now, I know that brother, he had his finale and stuff like that, so he probably ain't dealing with no more. It's the 23rd, 24th people in the Eve mindset, and then 25th, they open up presents. So, the people that's going to be doing it, they're going to do it on a mass scale. There'll be people who watch these debates and hear this class or some other ministers out there preaching against us, and the Lord will grip them through that to where they don't participate. And may the Lord have mercy on those brothers and sisters. The ones who don't understand now and participate, may the Lord have mercy on them in the future, and then they'll be spared from it. But the ones who know better, hold strong and tight. Do not let it go. As the apostle said, don't be deceived by those who come with high-sounding nonsense based on human logical thinking and spirits of the unknown world rather than from Christ. The apostles gave this commandment. You must have the same attitude that Christ Jesus had. That's a commandment. You must have the same attitude. Attitude means the way you think. You must have the same attitude Christ Jesus had. So you need to make sure that what you're doing is a direct reflection of the image of Christ. Because what you think you can do, you're saying Christ would do. So your testimony about Christ in the way that you live is either a truth or a lie. So you must be on guard for that. Lord's will, we're going to move on from this whole thing, and Lord's will, the next podcast it's supposed to be tomorrow. I might have to push it back a day because I was supposed to spend this time supposed to go and record the monologues so I can edit it tonight. But this took precedent, and so it's about to get dark here, so I'm gonna lose my light. So Lord, I'm gonna have to do that tomorrow. But if it's not what's the day? Tuesday. If it's not Thursday, then Lord's will Friday will be the podcast for this week. And but man, brothers, sisters, man, I can't emphasize enough. Remain vigilant, hold strong to what you have received from the Lord's apostles. We have the writings. Keep the same mindset that they had. Don't let nobody veer you from that. And regardless of people's intellectual thoughts, they only can rely upon the little books that they got, little sources they got, and stuff like that. But I read this because a lot of times they just read the sources to say, oh, they was doing Christmas in the second, third century. They was already kind of doing that before this. They kind of do that, but they don't tell you how this all developed. So you can see with a clear lens, oh my gosh, this falling away. This falling away happened. And look how it gradually happened. This is just about how we got Christmas, let alone it's something else. But man, look at this. Oh my Lord. We got the start off point. Ain't no debating that. We got the start off point. We got the absence of birthday celebrations in the Bible. We got the fact that the Jews of the Old Testament and of the New Testament, the Gentiles were celebrating birthdays all around them, but they didn't do it. We got that evidence. We got the law and the prophets and the mindset about birth versus death. We got that. We got Jesus Christ and the apostles in the way that they thought. We got Josephus. We got the people that accounted for the time of the apostles and the mindset. We got the fact that they say only sinners think like this and act like this. We have the start off point. But man, something changed drastically. Because look at where we at now. How did it happen? Oh, it happened like this, brothers and sisters. See, that Epiphany feast that everybody want to talk about that people was doing before Christmas and they already calculated a date. Yeah, what you need to understand about the Feast of Epiphany is that they actually adopted that from heretics. Yeah, the Feast of Epiphany, it didn't start off from Orthodox tradition. It didn't start off from those who knew the truth of the Lord. No, what happened was those who had let go of the truth of the Lord and went the way of apostasy, known as the Gnostics, they made up a feast following the doctrine of devils. They made up a feast called Epiphany, celebrating the incarnation happening at baptism. The fathers who were trying to, not all the fathers, just some of the fathers who were trying to combat them adopted their idolatrous feast that was centered around a false Jesus idea. They adopted it and mingled it with their own doctrines about Christ, thinking that that would supplant the original version that was, following the doctrine of demons. But then another controversy arose, brothers and sisters. Yeah, another controversy. Yeah, everybody talking about there's don't see nothing wrong with celebrating Jesus Christ's birth, December 25th, and the date and the calculations. Yeah, that idea also came as a result of heretics. Heretics known as the Arianism group, who rose up and caused to question Christ's birth. So now this thing that was the start-off point, the apostles and them didn't make a deal about birthdays because they viewed it as pagan practice. Origen writes about it. Only sinners alone make a big deal about births, but not saints. Not the sinners, not saints. You have those things. You have the start-off point, but then all of a sudden, to come back to Arianism people, a group of forefathers said, we need to focus on the birth. Then they said, we need to make a whole distinct feast in honor of the birth. Then this is how you get this gradual leaning towards December 25th being the birthday of Jesus. And even though it was just the Western churches that started doing that, not the Eastern churches, just the Western churches under the influence of Rome, the way it grew in popularity is because Constantine converted, adopted the Christian faith as the empire's religion. They went to unify the regions through sword and war and conquest. Their ideologies went with that. All right, led by the Pope and all that, and Catholicism, which is why Catholicism is the largest Christianity sect within the Christian world. And then there's things that came by way of them, like the white Jesus, like the saint statues, their Mary worship. That's why it's everywhere in the world. Because the people down in South America was practicing Catholicism, but retaining the origins of their pagan African ancestor worship, and now they worship auxiliaries and stuff, but using Catholic saint images to do so. And that's why you got that giant statue in Brazil with the Jesus like this. It's all connected back to pagan Rome and what they did to spread their version of Jesus and Christianity throughout the world. And many people hold to different things that came by way of that. Yes, you had the Protestant Reformation, but they didn't reform everything. Okay? They didn't reform everything. Okay? So, Lord's will in the future, we'll go down, we'll talk about these things a little bit more, but it's very important. People are going to do what they want to do, but I'm warning you brothers and sisters to hold on to the mindset that you've been taught by the apostles, follow the example of the early believers, not the generations that started to let their grip go, but the generation that received that tight grip foundation. Mimic them. And focus your attention not upon a bunch of feasts and holidays and dead saints, and now you got the All Souls Day and the little cakes and relics and stuff. Don't get caught up into that. Have the mindset that the apostles and them had concerning the truth about Christ, not making a big deal about birthdays, keeping that mindset, knowing it's coming from superstitious practice and paganism, so you don't fall into horoscopes and anything else, okay? And then focus your attention upon living upright. Focus your attention upon living upright causes you to be careful to discern what pleases the Lord, so that if you and your neighbor was at odds about something that was okay to do, the Lord has taught us through his doctrine that the one who's stronger, who don't believe nothing's wrong with the thing, that's not really wrong to do, but because their brethren is vexed by it, that stronger person should empty himself like the Lord did. Take on the form of the weak person so that y'all unity could continue. Even though in your mind, between you and God, your conscience is clear, you know there's nothing wrong with it, but because your brother's vexed, you don't want to destroy him, so therefore you won't do it. But look at these apologists, look at their attitudes. They say it's a Romans 14 issue, but yet it's like, if okay, pork is a Romans 14 issue. It's an actual Romans 14 issue, whether or not a brand can eat pork or not. But let's say, hey, here's the class. I'm a person of strong conscience. I believe there's absolutely nothing wrong with eating pork, okay? And then here it is, I'm having a class with people who are anti-pork, that profess the name of Christ. We're all brothers, but they got weak consciences regarding this matter. And here I am doing a class. It's all about the Bible, and I want to tell y'all the truth. But while I'm talking to you, I got a big old piece of ham just on the plate. And while I'm talking to you, I'm going like this. I want you to listen to the class. Pork is clean. Change my mind. Come on up here if you're anti-pork. Those dudes that's doing that are sinning because they're not walking in love. Their brother's vexed. They're having a whole vexing conversation. And then instead of like having this discourse and, hey, listen, let's talk about this. Let's do this, do this. No, it's a whole theatrics game for them. See, they want to showboat their so-called liberties. So they throw in their Santa hats and talk about, if you're anti-Christmas, come up here. So now you got your brother that's anti-Christmas. You up there with your Jingle Bell song playing in the background, your little Santa hat to the side, your little cocky little attitude, like Inspired Philosophy did when I debated him years ago about Christmas. I show up, he got his little Christmas hat on, and then he want to talk about, you like my hat? I say, no, God hated it too. In his mind, it's a non-essential issue, and God don't actually hate it. But when I said God hated it too, I wasn't just talking about the fact that he celebrated Christmas. I was talking about the fact that even if Christmas was okay, and yet he knows I'm vexed by this. And now we're having a conversation to get to the bottom of this. And instead of him emptying himself, following the pattern of the Lord, and leave all this Christmas garment at home to have this conversation, he decided he wanted to dress up as Santa Claus and go, you like my hat? What would the apostle think of that kind of attitude? They don't follow the example of Christ, so they're sinning. So stay away from those type of things. That's what I'm warning you brothers and sisters about. I can't say it long enough or enough times. We're going to talk about it more, but I'm already on here almost 4 hours. I done missed my shoot time. I got to push back the podcast, which is fine. This is important. I want to spend a lot of time on this. And so if there is any question after this, okay, after y'all saw this lead up, it was important that I read this lead up to what y'all got going on in 2 days. After hearing this lead up and knowing what the apostles of Jesus Christ and the church believed, if they were to come out their graves with the same lives and attitudes they had during their lifetime, and now they see the brothers and sisters doing what they're doing today, what would they think of them? They'd be like, this is foreign to us. Believers acting like sinners, making a deal about birthdays. These guys are talking about you celebrating the incarnation and the birth. Believers thinking other believers don't believe in Christ's deity because they don't celebrate Christmas. This is foreign to us. What has happened? What happened was a little grip let go. It made it harder to hold on to other stuff. You let that go. Start compromise here and there. And eventually you got a great falling away that takes place. So may the Lord have mercy on all his people. He knows all those that are his. He's going to redeem them and save them from the grips of the devil. The ones that know the truth, hold on to it. Do not let anybody deceive y'all. Follow the way of peace. Take care of your kids during the rest of the year. When the Lord allows you to have, take them to the store. Let them get a toy. Give them this occasion so that
they're not really missing anything, but so that they're not, they don't feel like they're missing anything with all the festivities going on and all the kids and the presents and people open up boxes and, oh, Santa Claus and all of that. Stay far away from that. All right. Teach them to fear Christ. Teach them to fear God. Keep his commandments. For that's the whole reason they were made and put on this earth. No, for no other reason. And so, Lord's will, it'll probably be Friday at this point that the podcast takes place. But so I'll have to change the time, but on the notification thing. But if there's any question prior to then, you can either send an email to TheChurchInTexas@gmail.com. Somebody might comment after the fact, after this live's over with, might comment, and I'll see in the comment section. Or you can email me at inandoutofseasonpodcast@gmail.com. And then Lord's will, I'll make sure that I address those things in the future class. So remember those things, brothers and sisters. Love you all. May the Lord peace and grace cover you all, and the brothers and sisters that are going away of error. May the Lord have mercy and redeem you from that. For you guys have, and some of you just ignorantly, but you're not holding to the mindset in which the apostles laid down for us. And you follow the traditions of men and their ways that they tried to combat liars. And all they did was create more confusion. So, and dissension. So, other than that, love you, brothers and sisters. Until next time, peace.